So I think we are at that moment. So I want to, first of all, just say good morning, good day to everyone, wherever you are in the world, and welcome you to this second day of the 150th anniversary of the birth of William Monroe Trotter, a pioneering social justice advocate, activist, journalist, who literally laid the groundwork for many of the movements that we find ourselves in this moment. My name is Cornell William Brooks. I'm a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and it is my honor to be a part of this incredible celebration of not only Trotter's life and legacy, but as importantly, the lineage and legacy of those who are carrying forward his work in this moment. So in this two-day convening, we are focused on three issues, the first of which is environmental justice, the second of which is reparations, and the third is voting rights. We have a star-studded lineup of activists, academics, scholars, artists, journalists, all of whom are helping us and taking us to the front lines of social justice. So on this first panel, we are pleased to welcome an extraordinary array of practitioners and journalists. I will welcome the moderator, but I want to lift up a modest housekeeping note. If for any reason there's any disruption in the service, you can view this convening on Facebook, on Twitter, and certainly on YouTube. So with that said, I want to welcome our moderator, that being Derek Z. Jackson, who is a great friend of this work. He is a nationally award-winning news, sports, entertainment, and social justice journalist, author, and photographer. That's another way of saying a Renaissance man. Most recently, Jackson was the 2021 winner for excellence in opinion writing in the Scripps Howard Awards. He was also the 2021 winner in both social justice and sports commentary from the National Society of Newspaper Columnists. He's a co-author and the photographer of the book Project Puffin, The Improbable Quest to Bring a Beloved Seabird Back to Egg Rock. He is also the author of a widely quoted 2017 paper on the national media's failure, note this, to cover the Flint water crisis when he served as a Shorenstein Fellow here at Harvard. In photography, his pictures of Jackson's presidential campaign, images of Barack Obama were exhibited in Boston's Museum of African American History. He holds not one, not two, but three honorary degrees from Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, Salem State University, and the Episcopal Divinity School. He, along with, and this is incredibly important for the moment in which we find ourselves, along with the late Pulitzer Prize winning columnist and author Les Payne, and the former USA Today columnist Dwayne Wickham, they were the founders of the Trotter group of Black columnists. And the first meeting was at Harvard. So I welcome to the stage a moderator who in his work has lifted up the lineage of William Monroe Trotter. And in this moment, he's answered our call to lead this very, very important discussion on environmental justice in our time. With that said, Derek, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Cornell, and good morning, everyone. And really good morning to you, Juan, out there in California at 6:04 a.m. To start off this session, I'd like to show you this image from my coverage of environmental injustice. This is Crystal Martinez and her two children. She lives in Southeast Chicago, and her mother lives on this block. She is the reason we are here for this panel today. This neighborhood, nearly all Latino and Black, is on permanent environmental assault. A few years ago, this neighborhood rose up and forced the closure of a pet coke coal ash operation run by the coke industries. The dust was so thick that residents without air conditioners had to keep their windows closed in 90-degree summer heat. But even after the coal mountains were gone, other industries remain that have contaminated front lawns and backyards with lead. And behind Crystal, in that red building behind her, is a plant that was discovered to be emitting dangerous levels of manganese dust, a neurotoxin with irreversible effects. This is symbolic of a nation where African Americans and Latinos disproportionately breathe in fossil pollution, bear higher burdens from living in heat islands and flood zones, regardless of class, because of the legacy of redlining, and face much lower chances of collecting relief payments. In a study published just this past December in Environmental Health Perspectives, Black seniors accounted for 33,000 of the nation's 133,000 deaths in 2014 from air particulate pollution, which is 25% of all senior deaths, even though Black seniors are just 9% of the senior population. Yet this world remains invisible to white consumers, regardless of party, who disproportionately produce global warming emissions and soot while being relatively spared the environmental injustice of fossil pollution in their communities or living in heat islands and flood zones. And even if they are hit by climate disasters, white families on average have much more access to property damage relief funds than families of color. According to both a 2021 poll by Axios Ipsos and a 2020 poll by West Harlem Environmental Action, We Act, and the Environmental Defense Fund, only a third of white adults know that Black and Latino communities do face more pollution than they do. Only 20% of white respondents in the We Act poll thought that environmental justice was a serious problem in their state. This is also a major moment of opportunity. I've also been fortunate to cover communities of color that are part of the energy transition and getting jobs through it. Here, if we can go to the slide, family, thank you. Here are families in San Diego, New Orleans, Southeast Washington, D.C., who receive solar through pilot programs. These are families that were paying $300 to $400 a month on their fossil fuel bills and saw their bills fall to $25, $50, and well under $100. The opportunities are only beginning in the renewable transition. And I'm going to show you some slides from offshore wind industries in Europe and the new one on Block Island, off Rhode Island. These opportunities are beginning as, even though we're 20 years behind Europe, it also has immense progress if people of color are included. Over in Europe, governments are so locked into goals and targets for renewable energy that workforce demand is expected to rise from its current 300,000 jobs to around 600,000 in 2025 and more than 850,000 jobs in 2030. Currently, it is estimated that about 300,000 are in that sector now, so that it may triple by the end of this decade. One question for today is, will people of color, after all these decades of bearing the brunt of fossil fuel pollution and bearing the brunt of risk in climate disasters, will we be granted equitable access to this sector? The Biden administration has made some unprecedented moves toward raising the profile of environmental justice throughout cabinet agencies. But is it truly doing all that it can? For many EJ activists, the administration is already pulling its punches on environmental injustice. Despite the cascade of science showing that systemic racism greatly determines which communities get polluted, the administration last month undercut its promises on environmental justice by unveiling a new system to identify beleaguered communities that did not include race. Here to discuss the promise and perils of this moment for environmental justice are Juan Flores, a community organizer for the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment. Juan is the lead organizer for its climate justice campaign and has led organizing efforts to stop fracking and other extreme methods of oil extraction. He's also led organizing efforts to achieve a comprehensive state law that will provide a 2,500-foot buffer zone from oil extraction sites to housing in California's communities. He's a lead organizer of CRPE's just transition efforts, which aim to achieve a just transition of oil workers to clean, safe, and unionized jobs. We also have Ebony Twilly Martin. Ebony is the co-executive director of Greenpeace USA. She's an accomplished operations strategist and justice activist. She has over 15 years of experience in the corporate and nonprofit sectors. She currently provides leadership in developing and managing the organization's overall strategic direction, representation, policy, resources, operations, and communication, ensuring effective management and control of Greenpeace resources. Now, with her passion for justice and equity, Ebony advances the work of Greenpeace USA through outreach, relationship building, and partnerships to build a domestic and international progressive movement based in peace, sustainability, and social justice. And last but not least, Wally Maizon, a climate activist and currently advocacy lead for Sunrise Movement, a movement of young people uniting to stop the climate crisis. Maizon has previously served as a political campaigning coordinator, field organizer, and political advisor to Sunrise Movement. Maizon previously served as an organizing lead and Freedom Fellow, community organizer for Dream Defenders, a political advocacy and organizing group founded in 2012 after the tragic killing of Trayvon Martin. Maizon holds a degree from Santa Fe College and a bachelor's degree in African American Black Studies from the University of Florida. With that, we'll open the floor to 3 to 5 minutes of comment from our panelists, and then we'll go into questions, and then we will take questions from the audience that will be fed to me through chat. So, Ebony, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to thank Professor Brooks and you, Mr. Jackson, and the panelists, and just so glad and grateful to be with you all today to discuss these important issues that are impacting our communities directly. As you mentioned, the administration is moving forward with attempting to address environmental justice issues, but has specifically taken racial equity out of the equation. And that is perplexing to us on a number of levels. As Dr. Robert Bullard said, the most powerful predictor of industrial pollution is race. It's not about your income. It's not about your property value, but years of research has shown that it's race. And unfortunately, this country has been founded on a legacy of exploitation, extraction, and patriarchy. This has led to systemic oppression in a web that is all interconnected. So we see the basic necessities of our lives, clean air, clean water, just the basics that we look for in life don't exist for us. And I started my environmental journey as a mother when my son was diagnosed with asthma. And as I began to look into it, I thought that it was hereditary. And his pediatrician actually told me, no, it's probably from the pollution in your neighborhood. And this was shocking to me. And as I began to do more research, I learned that Black people were more disproportionately impacted by asthma and more likely to die. And the culprit of that was pollution, and that's directly connected back to fossil fuel pollution. So that makes fossil fuels also a public health crisis. And until the administration and also we as people join together to start to hold our government officials accountable, we will continue to see this cycle. But I'm glad today that we have an opportunity to connect, to talk, to strategize, to figure out different ways that we can elevate this issue and, of course, bring true liberation and change to all those communities that need it. So thank you again. I'll pass it back to you, Derek.
Thank you. Juan.
Yes. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. And I just want to say that one of the things that I have experience in 11 years of organizing, and I've been doing this organizing for the same organization through these last 11 years, is that I'm seeing that the key results that we have got from all of this organizing have come from key experiences that every other social justice movement in the nation has taught us, which is persistence and keep fighting. It's so easy for people in position of powers, which in the majority of times are white people, and sorry to drill on that, but when you look in communities like Kern County in California, where 53% of the population are Latinos, but the board of supervisors is nothing but white people. uh, we see that reflected, right, on that. But these people that are in positions of power always look down on us, right? When you go up to them and you say, look, your job is to represent me, not to represent an industry. We elected you so you can fight in our behalf. But what they do is they laugh or they don't pay attention to you. Sometimes it's very discouraging. But like Miss Ebony said right now, when you have the mothers who are up in the front fighting for the life of their children, for their own survival, and for the survival of our planet as mothers, that has a huge impact. And that's what I have seen in 11 years, the power of women on the environmental justice movement. Our environmental justice movements are literally powered by women, and we gotta be realistic about that. So as an advice to everyone, please, reach out to mothers. Please reach out to the women in your neighborhood, because they are the fighters. It's within their blood. I have experienced that. Our movement in California, the movement against the fossil fuel industry, has been driven by that power, by that passion of the women in their hearts. So again, some of the key lessons that we learned is that one person alone would hardly make, a lot of noise. But when you generate a movement, when you make your movements inclusive, from youth to the elderly, to Asians, Latinos, Blacks, and whites, that's where we as a nation even have the most power, and where we can move things the faster. As the number one economy in the world, we have the means to make the transformation and to move into the next phase of our energy and to set an example to the entire world. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you, Juan. And Wally, you have definitely been organizing some young folks, so you take it in.
Yeah, want to thank my colleagues for being here. Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Thank you, Professor Brooks. Wow, Juan, Ebony, y'all are like really singing to my soul when y'all are talking about like persistence and true liberation. I started organizing really like right after high school, doing racial justice with the Dream Defenders, as was stated before. And yeah, there was a lot of problems in Florida, and there's still a lot of problems now. And I think the first time I like really dug into climate justice was after a hurricane in like 2017 that didn't necessarily hit Florida, but it displaced a lot of people in Puerto Rico. And I saw how the governor at the time, Rick Scott, was using this crisis as like a tool to like basically get reelected, and just like using people and like as like they were disposable. And it really like opened my eyes to like, wow, not only am I like dealing with all these like racial problems, Black and brown people get displaced by natural disasters and also are like used as tools for what Juan was saying, white people in power. So that is like something that, really opened my eyes. And that's why I started like organizing with Sunrise, and like my climate awakening really like has brought me through a lot of like different experiences, from like being in Iowa in 2019 trying to get young people excited about pushing for a Green New Deal, trying to get presidential candidates to like say they support a Green New Deal for future generations, and ultimately like winning like that battle, because like most of the presidential candidates said that they support a Green New Deal. And it also has brought me to like being in Georgia, trying to win that special election so we could have a majority in the Senate. And it's also brought me into the Build Back Better fight, trying to get a civilian climate corps for you know, in this reconciliation package, trying to really like bridge the gap between good jobs and fighting climate. So it's been a real difficult struggle, but it's also, I don't know, I think that like what makes me hopeful for the future is seeing like all the young people who have also been like on the front lines fighting this fight. When I was in Iowa, I remember being at like a rally, having like this 7-year-old like at this rally saying that they cared about climate justice and that they wanted to like organize for their future. And that just like when I get tired, I just like think about the moments where I see like that young girl, other young people around the country, other, not even like young people, I see like older people like really like organizing with us and like giving us wisdom. And that really makes my heart jump, because we really need to build a multiracial cross-class movement of working class people that are going to organize and build the society, the future that we want. So yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity to talk and look forward to like getting some good conversation.
Yeah, so Wally, let's, you know, the Environmental Voter Project determined that voters who identified as environmental voters made a big difference in several battleground states in the presidential election 2020. And you were on the ground in Georgia for the Senate runoff, of which young voters who identified as environmental voters made a huge difference. In fact, there were 6,000 voters, according to the project, 6,000 people who voted in the runoff that did not vote in the presidential election. And so that's pretty much unheard of in presidential and non-presidential, comparing a presidential with a non-presidential election. So the big question is, can that base that you helped turn out, can that be fired up again in terms of the history? The history of what usually happens in midterm elections, and where is the energy, and otherwise, where is the energy going in your movement to keep young voters engaged?
Well, I think right now we're just trying to get politicians to like do what they promise to young people, right? I think like what we did to turn out people in like 2020, what we did to like get people like fired up was really important. And I think like right now our government is like really failing us. And I think like what we need to do now is just like, I hate to say it, but like tell people that like, hey, I know this isn't like really good right now, but like we remember what happened in 2016 when Trump got elected. We remember the majority when the Republicans were in control, like how that affected our communities. And right now we are still trying to pass Build Back Better through budget reconciliation. And, you know, we have 2 senators who are holding up progress for the entire country. And I'll say their names, Joe Manchin and Christian Sinema, because it needs to be stated that they are taking money from fossil fuel corporations and really holding up progress. And I don't think Joe Biden has done a really good job at like really pushing them to do the right thing, and that's unfortunate. But we still have an opportunity to push our elected officials to pass like meaningful legislation. And what you were talking about, the numbers being on the ground, people like, so when we were in Georgia, we obviously were doing things for the runoff, but we also were involved in like a local race. And there was like a utility board race where like there was like this really awesome like Black man progressive who was running to unseat this like this guy who was incumbent for like 30 years, who was like, I don't know, voted to like turn off people's like utilities if they couldn't pay it during a pandemic. And we lost that race by like a few votes. And if we like would have turned out more people, if more people were invested in local races, we could have made even a larger impact in that community. So I think like we need to focus on the macro and the micro when it comes to races, and we need to like really emphasize how important it is to like turn out. But we also need to do my job as an organizer to like pressure these politicians to enact change so people can get excited about who they're voting for.
Thank you. Ebony or Juan, do you want to jump in on that? I mean, it makes me think of, to throw in as well, you know, at this moment, what's the, you know, biggest positive thing that you've seen happen in terms of, you know, getting in EJ victories, and, you know, what is, you know, what's the biggest, challenge at this moment? Obviously, Wally just mentioned one, or depending on your point of view, two, in terms of the Senate. So.
I think one of the biggest challenges, as Wally said, is the corporate capture of our government. Our government should be, and our democracy should be, our best tool to advance environmental justice. And right now, it's completely captured by corporations, namely fossil fuel corporations. Something simple that should have been passed in Build Back Better were fossil fuel subsidies. We give $15 billion of our tax money goes to fossil fuel executives to basically poison our land, poison our water, and poison our air. We are paying them to do that. And a simple solution, like why? And when we bring these things up, they want to be swept under the rug, they want to be dismissed, but that money should be reinvested back into communities. We wouldn't need an EJ 40 if we had that $15 billion, because that money would have went right back into our communities, right back into our healthcare systems, right back into divesting these hot spots that we have around the country. So it grieves me that simple things have captured our government, captured our money, and are polluting us. And to Juan's point and to Wally's point, the only thing that is going to capture this government back is if we as people mobilize and start to hold our government officials accountable. We cannot continue to accept false promises and false solutions that are greenwashing, and we have to expose it. And so that's probably where my heart right now is, in terms of what solutions we should have. And Greenpeace is going pretty hard on the fossil fuel subsidies. They did take out the international, but the national is still $15 billion. And that's ridiculous.
And just to add to what Ms. Ebony and Wally said, there's this false narrative in our nation of energy independence. And we believe that the more oil that we extract in this nation, the more energy independent we're going to be. And that's completely not true, because then we're going to be hosting, or we're going to be keeping our communities hostage to bad air quality, bad water quality, and to the array of different health issues that come with that. If we truly want to be energy independent, we have to invest in renewable energy. There's no other way. And we have to let go of the greedy corporation of the oil industry, because they always come back with this narrative of like, if we don't extract it in the United States, we're gonna get it from other nations where civil rights issues are put it on the ground, where peoples are not being protected. Like if in the United States our communities of color were any better. Like if what they do in our nation it's anything different, when it's not. It's the same greedy corporations that abuse in other nations that keep abusing our communities. So again, any piece of legislation has to have communities of color, low-income communities on the front and center of it. That's the only way that it's going to work for us. And money has to come directly to these communities. There's so much red tape that by the moment that all these funds arrive to our communities, we get peanuts instead of a really nice piece of meal. And we need to put all that down.
Mm. Ebony, you in representing Greenpeace, I want to ask you how much, as I mentioned earlier, only 20% of white respondents in the WEAC poll thought that environmental justice was a serious problem in their state, which is another way of, wondering how much of a gap still remains between what is considered old line environmentalism. The cliche would be polar bears and melting icebergs, things that are and compared to being poisoned, having lead poisoning, Flint water crisis, asthma, and toxic dumping and Superfund sites in your backyard. I know you've been reasonably successful in getting people of color, BIPOC folks in the ranks of Greenpeace. Across the board among, quote, old line environmental groups, how successful thus far is the transition from, breaking down the silo between, quote, environmentalism as kind of defined by wildlife and land trusts, and environmental injustice, which probably shouldn't be two separate silos, but how much are the old line organizations actually doing, and how successful have they been in that transition?
I would say that there has probably been an awakening over the last 2 to 3 years. Unfortunately, the murder of George Floyd even brought a racial reckoning, I think, within the larger green groups that have had to really prioritize what it means. We like to say the words diversity and inclusion, but it has to actually go a step beyond to what justice is and what justice and science demand right now in the moment. And I think that organizations have been facing that reckoning and have had to hold themselves accountable. When I came to Greenpeace, as you said, there were polar bears and tigers. And, I would raise my hand and say, but I can't breathe. My son can't breathe. We're missing a whole issue. And what that has also meant is there have to be more people at the table that look like us, that are in charge of strategy and also decision making. Because it's one thing to bring in a Black or brown person, but to ask them to acclimate to a system that's already dysfunctional, if you're saying you truly want transformation and change. And I think that also the broader movement is identifying that they have been losing, essentially. The ice caps are still melting. The earth is still heating up. So there has been a missing key element. And Black and brown people have always had an intrinsic connection to the earth. And so to disregard our strategies, our solutions, and our leadership in this moment would only bring them quicker to their demise. So I think you see a shift occurring. Is it quick enough? No, but it does give a bit of hope that it is occurring.
Great, thank you. Anybody, Juan or Wally, do you want to add to that before we go to questions from the audience?
Oh, I think Ebony captured it completely. I wouldn't add anything more to that.
Okay, great. Well, let's go to a couple good questions that have come in. Prior to the pandemic, the Green New Deal was introduced and considered a massively broad piece of legislation. In retrospect, which elements of the legislation would have been beneficial in addressing our current environmental justice needs in the wake of the current pandemic?
Well, I mean, I guess I can start with this. I think like, it's like, I wouldn't say, okay, so the Green New Deal is basically like a jobs program. I mean, like, if we're like really looking at the pieces of the legislation, the federal jobs guarantee, the stuff that we were pushing through Build Back Better with the Civilian Climate Corps, we really want to intersect the relationship between putting people to work fighting climate catastrophe. And as we saw during the pandemic, people losing jobs, not like people who have jobs not having the benefits in like healthcare. We really need to like figure out how to do this in a way that's just for people of color, because we see when these crises happen that we're hit the hardest, and I think that's what the Green New Deal is trying to solve, and sort of like a way that I'm like, the way I'm thinking about it is that like, yeah, putting people to work fighting the climate crisis. But we also know that like there's like so much other like pieces of legislation that need to be passed to kick off this like decade of the Green New Deal. Well, that's what we kind of call it, where we are like focusing on transforming all sectors of the economy. Yeah, so I think, yeah, I'm just like rambling, but there's like a lot. Yeah, like you said, the Green New Deal is very broad and it's like a massive piece of legislation. And I think like right now, what we need to do is like focus on the job aspects of like putting people to work in a way that's just for Black and brown communities.
Great. Another question that's come in is, well, you actually, to some degree, you've already addressed it, Ebony, but you know, we can expand on it. Due to the rise of corporations and other business entities that exploit natural resources, how can environmental law and justice come into this scenario? And I think I want to preface the, you know, it's really interesting. We're really in a really tenuous moment on the law and environmental justice because of the way that the former president before Biden packed the Supreme Court. Because right now, even as we speak, arguments were heard about a month ago, about a few weeks ago, in a very critical case brought forth by conservative states in concert with the coal industry and other fossil fuel interests, and including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce did an amicus brief. So that in theory is, you know, the titans of industry are basically arguing at the Supreme Court to curb the powers of the EPA to regulate global warming gases. And should that happen, there's an obvious impact. What can be done? What could be done should the Supreme Court, you know, truly curb one of the only tools that a president has in the absence of federal energy policy?
I can go ahead and start. Yes, it's very disheartening that essentially the EPA has been gutted, and many of the victories that we won, we saw them all erased in a matter of 4 years with regards to environmental regulation. One thing Greenpeace has been known for is specifically our litigation and our litigation against corporations, and also in some regards against the government when things are occurring, as we see on a large scale, where we see the laws and things of that nature being rolled back. Unfortunately, it can't just be left to, we have litigation as a tool to kind of continuously fight that, but I guess I call our strength back again to mobilizing people to fight against this onslaught that we're seeing with regards to our government, basically waging war on people, on our water, on our air. And I'm excited about the appointment of Ketanji Brown. We believe that she will have, with her lived experiences, bring that to her rulings. And we are encouraged that we believe we have an ally now, but we cannot just rest on our laurels with the Supreme Court or with the government. I think we as people have to continue to mobilize and demand more of our government.
And just to build on that, I think that it's our responsibility now as well to keep encouraging our communities to bring down this system. I mean, because even when we look at the constitution of this nation, it was, sorry, I'm gonna speak as an immigrant now, okay? But when we look at the constitution of this nation, it was not written to defend the rights of people of color. It was written to defend the white people in their future and whatever their legacy was. And our political system has been built on that. And that's the political system that we have to bring down. I mean, it's no coincidence and it's no accident that fewer people of color have access to higher education than white folks, right? Therefore, they are the ones that hold more positions of power. We need to bring all of this down. It's a systematic racism from the more basic levels, right? And that's what we're facing on. But that's what should encourage us. I mean, I have seen transformation in small communities and larger communities in California, who for the longest were being controlled by the all white folks, you know, to perhaps Arvin in California, who 4 years ago had the most youngest progressive council in the whole state, and who in Kern County were able to establish a buffer zone within Kern County, which is the #1 oil extraction county. That was huge. So we have witnesses that we are able to make this political transformation happen. All it takes is for us to get up, to mobilize people, but not only mobilize people, but to truly mobilize hearts, to educate folks to continue living on this progressive path. So we need to put that as well on action, which is to bring down the systematic racism and the political system that keep oppressing us.
Great, thank you. We have like 2 minutes left in this session. There was one last question. You know, what are your thoughts on using the framework of social determinants of health as a framework for creating environmental justice policies? And I mean, I think I'm aware that there are definitely many EJ groups, and you mentioned, of course, Ebony, just from a personal aspect of asthma, that EJ and health are vitally tied. Any particular thoughts on how that can be elevated? Again, as I mentioned, this is an area that, for some reason, most of the United States is not, amazingly unaware of these health disparities.
I think that's an excellent question. And actually, research shows when we link environmental issues to health, it gets a better response from the public. I think a lot of times our communities unfortunately don't know. And I mean, I didn't know why my son had asthma. We don't know why we're developing cancer at higher rates. We don't know why we're seeing birth defects. In California, folks don't know why their noses are bleeding. Because these things are hidden and undercover, and then we go to the doctors and we're given different reasons. And so that's also why it's important to have doctors that look like us as well, that can actually connect back what our issues are to what we're experiencing in the environment. So I think it's a constant effort and constant testing. And I think more groups, more EJ groups, more big green groups need to come together as a coalition and start to do more message testing to see what's resonating with folks. And then, quite frankly, just back to what Wally said, is also systemic racism, because white people aren't sick with the same things. These things aren't affecting them. So there is a bit of a disconnect. So it's up to us to continue to sound the alarm and to continue to educate our communities as to why we are experiencing certain sicknesses and certain harm. But that is something also I've been pushing Greenpeace on. Why aren't you talking to moms who are having sick children or being caretakers to those who have suffered from cancer because they've been in the coal mines? So just doing more. I think we as an environmental movement also like to talk about numbers a lot. We like to talk about the science of it, but really at the end of the day, you have to create the frame that connects to people's hearts, to connect to what people are experiencing. And I think that the more that we do that, the more we'll start to see change.
Great. Quickly, Juan or Wally, you have a closing thought to along with Ebony's?
Yes. Everything Ebony said was like absolutely correct. Juan, you're really like resonate. Like I'm resonating with what you were saying, because like we need to touch people's hearts. Like it breaks my heart to hear Ebony's story about her son having like asthma. Like it breaks my heart to hear these things, and the way we like reach out and touch people, like it's by telling our stories about how the climate like catastrophe has affected our lives. Like I am not a scientist. Like I'm just like some organizer from Florida. Like I don't know all the numbers, but I do remember like seeing people like, you know, in Louisiana during Katrina, like on the roofs of their houses while like water was like rising, they had to be on the roofs. I do remember like in Houston where like Joel Osteen wouldn't let people in their church, in his church. Like I remember these things, it's like clear as day to me. And when we connect with people, we're trying to build this movement to like stop these things from happening. We need to talk to people. Like we can't stay in our silos. Like one of my African-American professors, shout out to Dr. Alajumo, always said like, there's no unity without community. So if we really want to unify, we need to like be in like on the ground, talking to people, resonating with people's hearts. And like when we're talking about building this movement, people who are like watching right now, I really want to like emphasize this, like, you know, there is room in this movement for everyone. Like you don't have to like, you know, do all the things that we're doing. Just like do something, talk to your parents, talk to your family about what's going on in your community right now. I'm telling you, like the littlest things make the biggest impact. And there's always like like these things in our mind that's saying that we can't like affect change. I think about that all the time, but I think about my ancestors and like what they did. Like you think like we know better than them? Like, you know, like they've been in the streets, they've made such a big impact in our lives right now. And we can do the same right now. We just have to mobilize and like stay hopeful for a brighter future. I guarantee we can get there if we all work together.
And Juan, you get the last word.
And yes, and I'll be very brief. And I think, yes, we have to talk about the health of our communities. It has to be on the forefront of our fight, because we have to make sure that elected officials, corporations understand that communities of color, the people that live in there, our lives, are not expandable and are not disposable. And we have to make sure that our communities are not experimental zones. I mean, Ebony was talking to that, right? Like, we don't even know what's killing us because they are not willing to give us upfront what chemicals they're using with the fracking, what chemicals are they using when they're isolizing, right? So we gotta make sure of that our communities do not become sacrifice zones and experimental zones.
Great. Well, thank you, Juan, Wally, and Ebony, for your insightful thoughts and bringing your experience to this session. Thank Cornell for putting it all, and his staff, Chloe and other folks for putting this all together. And we hope this was helpful in, getting out some of the perils and the promise of environmental injustice and getting environmental justice. Thank you. Have a good morning. And back to you, Cornell.
Thank you so much, Derek. This was an extraordinary panel. There's so many quotable quotes and tweetable quotes. Wally, I think you may have the Pulitzer Prize for quotable quotes. That is to say, when you said the littlest things had the biggest impact with respect to the pursuit of environmental justice. And so just incredibly, incredibly powerful. I certainly appreciate Ebony's words when she spoke about the fact that we can speak about the science, but we need to speak to people's hearts. For all of our viewers and all of the folks who are tuning in, who are looking for insight, inspiration, incisive analysis as to what we need to do going forward, I think you heard a lot of what can be helpful in terms of movement building for the planet, for our communities, for our world. So extraordinarily grateful to Juan Flores, Ebony Martin, Wally Maizon, and of course, Derek Z. Jackson. Just grateful for all that you have done and the wisdom that you've shared with us. So we are looking forward to another wonderful panel concerning reparations. And as you know, and may know, William Monroe Trotter, as a pioneering social justice figure, fought against peonage, debt, slavery. He fought against Jim Crow segregation. He fought for voting rights. He fought against lynching. Those challenges back then are the constitutive elements of the cry and the call for reparations. So this next panel speaks to the past and speaks to the present and certainly speaks to the future. So we encourage you to stay tuned for the panel that is coming up at 11 o'clock. And for those of you who may want to view this program on other platforms, you can do so on YouTube, on Twitter, and on Facebook. So be sure to take advantage of that. That is to say, you can watch this live stream on YouTube. That is to say, the Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice on Facebook, the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice, and Twitter at Harvard_Trotter. So we look forward to you joining the program at 11. We also want to remind you that following that panel, we have a panel with a great number of voting rights activists led by Frederick Whitfield. And that panel will follow the next panel on reparations in about an hour. So we have a few moments. So if you need to take a break, please do so. And please come back at 11 Eastern Standard Time for our next discussion on reparations as we continue to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the birth of William Monroe Trotter here at the Harvard Kennedy School and across the country and literally around the world. We'll see you in a few.
Hi, Aria.
Good morning. How you doing?
You've probably been watching the panels, but I shot a few opening questions to you guys about an hour ago. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah.
Hello, Professor Bilmus.
Hi, Deborah. Hi. I'm at the United Nations, so I've just
Awesome.
stepped out for a minute. They've given me this beautiful room, so I haven't seen anything, but I do have coverage in this room.
I haven't seen anything either.
Is there anything surprising?
I don't see Sydney here. I'm gonna call Sydney and see, make sure that she has access.
Trying to figure out how to put this background on my.
Go up to Zoom and preferences. Hi, Sydney, this is Deborah. Are you logging in?
Virtual background.
So again, good morning and good day to everyone, wherever you are in the world. We are delighted to host this next panel on reparations. As you know, we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of William Monroe Trotter, who was a pioneering social justice activist journalist in American history, and a son of Boston, a son of Harvard. But for this conversation, we're reminded that he spent nearly the whole of his life addressing issues like Jim Crow, segregation, peonage, or debt, slavery, racialized violence, as in lynching. These are the constitutive elements, if you will, of the call and the cry for reparations in our time, this many decades later. And so we have assembled an extraordinary panel of experts, practitioners, scholars, journalists to speak to this question in this moment. And so I'll just take a moment to introduce a wonderful, wonderful colleague of mine who I believe is standing firmly in that lineage and legacy of activist journalists. That would be Deborah Douglas. She is the co-editor of The Emancipator, which is a collaboration between Boston University and the Boston Globe that reimagines the first abolitionist newspapers for a new day. That is to say, a 2022 day. She wrote the U.S. Civil Rights Trail, a traveler's guide to people, places, and events that made the movement. And I would just simply say it is a wonderful, no plug here, wonderful, wonderful guide. This you need to have in your library. She's also contributed to 400 Souls, a community history of African America. She served as the Eugene S. Pulliam Distinguished Visiting Professor of Journalism at DePaul University and was a senior leader of the Op-Ed Project at Northwestern. She served as Northwestern's Medill School, spearheaded a Civil Rights Act of 1964 graduate investigative journalism project, and she's just been a wonderful colleague in the work, and I know that we're in good hands taking up this critical topic in this difficult time. So with that said, Deborah, just introduce all these wonderful people, and there are lots of folks who are interested and anxious to hear what you all have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. And I always love doing anything that you're a part of, Professor Brooks. I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists today very briefly because I want to spend more time hearing from them. First of all, we have in our panel Professor Linda J. Bilmus, a leading expert on budgeting and public finance, and the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Senior Lecturer Chair in Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she teaches courses on budgeting and financial management and leads training sessions for newly elected mayors and members of Congress. Her research focuses on how budgetary resources are allocated, particularly with respect to the military, war costs, veterans issues, and the value of public lands and state and local governments. Bilmus previously served as Assistant Secretary and Chief Financial Officer of the U.S. Department of Commerce from 1998 to 2001. Welcome. Aria Florent. Am I saying that right? Florence? All right. As co-founder of Liberation Ventures, a philanthropic and field-building organization fueling the U.S. Black-led movement for racial repair. Prior to Liberation Ventures, Aria served public and social sector clients at McKinsey & Company and helped develop the McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility. She was also an organizer in East Palo Alto, California, focusing on youth development and civic engagement. In 2017, Laurent helped launch the first ever round of programs at the Obama Foundation. Yay! Aria received a BA from Stanford University, an MBA from the Wharton School, and an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome. And then I will introduce Sydney Scott. Sydney Scott is a senior at Columbia University studying political science and government. And for the past year and a half, Scott has worked as a strategist for the Global Sports Initiative at Harvard University and a research and editorial intern at the Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity at the Atlantic Philanthropies. Scott recently became the first ever Columbia female student athlete to become a Rhodes Scholar, and in October 2022 will attend Oxford University. Welcome, Sydney.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to just dive into the deep end here, and then we'll work back into how each of you have come to this issue with your work. So my first question for you is addressing reparations an if question or a when question? Professor Bilmus, would you like to kick us off? And you want to come off mute.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and very nice to see the rest of the panel, particularly Aria, who's a long time ago former student of mine. My sense is that really the issue is not if or when, but how, because the U.S. actually has a very long-standing social norm of paying reparatory compensation as a routine mechanism through which the U.S. compensates victims of harms. There are actually hundreds of programs in which we employ this mechanism, and we compensate people who were harmed by exposure to nuclear radiation. We compensate farmers whose crops or livestock were damaged through drought or floods or pests or plant disease or any other reason. We compensate anyone in the fishing industry whose ability to earn a livelihood has been impacted by weather or trade. We compensate people who have been impacted by federal trade agreements. We compensate people who have had adverse reactions to vaccines or other medicines. There is a very long list. In fact, it ranges into the hundreds. And so when I say it is a matter of how, I mean, actually the question of whether or not we should be providing compensations doesn't make any sense to me, given the way the United States actually handles other types of harms. Our system is if A, then B. If there's a harm, then we pay some compensation. And the question becomes what financial mechanisms we use. And I won't take up all my opening time now to discuss it, but there is a whole range of different types of financing mechanisms, a subject of great interest to me, through which we pay for these various types of what I call reparatory compensation.
Great, thank you so much for that. I know, Ms. Laurent, you have some thoughts about the if and how question.
I do. I mean, I absolutely think this is a win. I think that Professor Bilmus is doing really, really important research, in particular because in my work and in many of my conversations, what I hear is people using this question of how as sort of a distraction mechanism to take the conversation away from the why and the what. And I think that like what's going to be so amazing when this paper comes out that they're working on is that it will basically say like we actually know how to do this because we do it in so many other areas. And so it will, it like ideally it sort of takes that question of, oh, well, this isn't feasible off the table, and enables the conversation to get back to, the what and the why, and more importantly, how we get enough people on board and really increase public support for this to the point where we will win. So I think it's a win. I think about other movements when I'm, trying to make sure that I'm staying optimistic. Marriage equality, we have more public support for reparations right now than marriage equality did when that movement first began. And so that is always kind of like an anchoring statistic for me, in that, to me, it's a win, but it's a win because I have so much faith in the people that I work with and in, this movement and in Black folks to continue pushing until we see this happen and come to fruition. So I think it's a win because I believe in I think it's a win because I believe in my people.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Sydney.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate what both of you shared. And I actually did not know that statistic. So that's, that sort of contextualizes, how support for things and how movements grow, which I think is really interesting. I definitely agree. I think focusing on the why and the what are really important, because I think especially the if question, it's sort of at the outset puts the conversation onto a path where there is this lack of acknowledgement of the historicity of discrimination against Black people and the sort of ubiquity of the barriers to access of accumulating wealth that have existed for, literally the entire history of this country. And I think it sort of situates it into this place where we're no longer accepting that as a sort of fundamental understanding that there is a debt that is owed that has yet to be repaid. And so I think, we definitely try to steer away from this if question, because, it sort of puts you back in that place with the how, which is, the how that Aria mentioned at first, which is, like, how would this even happen? And sort of, is this feasible? And it's not something that's worth considering. And so we, in a lot of our conversations, we focus on the practice and, the people who would be impacted by it, because, focusing on whether or not it's a valid inquiry or not in the first place, is, sort of decontextualizes all of the, all of that history.
Yeah, thank you for that. Ms. Laurent actually alluded to my next question with the mention of marriage equality, but I'm wondering if we could go a little bit deeper and talk about where the reparations issue stands within the history of social justice. And Professor Bilmus, I would love to hear your thoughts on that, if you can, or any of you. You're on mute.
I think after 2 years, you learn this. I'm speaking to you from the United Nations, where I'm here in my capacity as the United States member of the Committee of Experts. And so we've had quite a week here. And so I apologize if you hear yelling in the background in 165 different languages. So, but I think the UN is a place to start in terms of thinking about this, because the United Nations has actually for quite a few years now been examining the issue of racial justice and has been issuing multiple reports and so on, which look at the nature of reparations in many different circumstances around the world. And the UN has specifically called for reparations in a broad sense for Black Americans in the United States. And I want to say that it is important in the United Nations context to think about this globally. And the way the UN looks at this issue in terms of social justice is that there are several components of a full-scale reparations program, starting with apologies and guarantees of non-repetition, and financial restitution is one of sort of 5 parts of this. And what we see in the United States repeatedly throughout our history is it's kind of a mixed bag. We don't typically do apologies, and what we do, and we do it repeatedly and routinely, discernible harm that Congress takes up, is we provide financial restitution. That is the piece of this overall picture that the United States has repeatedly taken up. And so I think that it's important to think about the fact that this is part of a broader movement worldwide toward social justice, towards reconciliation, toward understanding that what happens today and the way we live our lives today and social equity today is a legacy. It has grown out of what happened before.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Ms. Ron, did you want to add something?
Yeah, well, I think that was really important grounding, first of all. And then the other thing that I would just add is that I know that reparations has gotten sort of a lot more attention in the last couple of years. But I do think it's also important to say that this is not a new movement, even within the US at all. This fight began before slavery was even abolished. There are, originally it was 40 acres and a mule that were promised in 1865. But it was Queen Mother Moore at the UN who really brought this to prominence in the 50s. One of the legacy organizations that my organization supports is called NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. They were founded in 1987 and have been holding this torch since then, and still going strong. I think that Ta-Nehisi Coates brought it to prominence in 2014, obviously with his piece. But I think what we've seen is sort of these like peaks and troughs of energy, and we're in a peak, but our job is to then be able to sustain that peak and ensure that the peaks continue to get higher and higher.
Thank you so much. Sydney, did you want to add anything?
Sure, yes. I love that you brought up 40 acres and a mule, because I think that it's something that I didn't learn about, when I was in high school. I didn't learn about that until I was in college. And it really foregrounds the idea that reparations is, it's almost an inherent, it's almost a given, like when emancipation, happened, there, you have an entire class of people that were previously unpaid laborers that, what happens to economies, what happens to the land, like what happens practically to to people's lives. And the idea of giving these people, just something to be able to begin to build self-sufficiency and again, build wealth. it was an idea that was pretty inherent to the transition from legal chattel slavery to emancipation, and so to know that the ideals of the idea of reparations, of being able to to be able to begin to rectify, was a part of the conversation so early in our history, I think really sort of grounds that idea. And I also just think that in terms of social justice, especially as young people engage with it, I think that a lot of these conversations are about conferring benefits and about sort of pursuing, equity, liberation, things like that. And I think that reparations plays a role that constitutes sort of meeting a bottom standard. I think that reparations is, this sort of the first, not the first step, obviously, but, ideologically, the first step towards racial justice, racial equity, because it has to be built upon a barrier, upon a foundation of equity. And so I think that, for all of these sort of additional pursuits, I think that reparations is a really foundational tenet to the idea of social justice and racial justice.
That's awesome. I'm going to come to you again because now I want to drill down and I want to hear from each of you about how you come to this issue in your work. We're going to get an opportunity to hear from you, Sydney, your work on the ground and your institution building, Aria, and Professor Bilmus, this exquisite paper that you put together. But first, I want to hear from Sydney. Tell us about your work.
Absolutely. So I know I'm sort of, the youngest one on the panel here. I'm only 22. And so especially as Aria just mentioned, reparations work and reparations advocacy has been going on for a very, very, very long time in this country. I'm and internationally, I'm a very new and, sort of humble entrant. But essentially, over the course of 2020, I started doing a research project with a professor at my school, and he was interested in race-conscious policy versus race-neutral policy and public opinion polling and whatnot. And so I was doing some research into race-conscious policy, and I came across Evanston's reparations resolution. And it just was so interesting to me because I'm a political science major and an African-American studies minor. And even being at, fairly progressive university, at least sort of academically, I had never encountered the idea of reparations beyond this sort of, political non-starter, this infeasibility. I sort of heard it tossed around, but it was one of those ridiculous things. And so to see that there was a practicable mechanism for reparations, especially, sort of that didn't have to stay within the bounds of cash payouts or, something like that, was really, really interesting to me. So I ended up doing a research project of my own and got really interested in the idea. And essentially I sort of came and I was sitting there and I was like, I've done all of this research. I've thought about this. I've, all of these different feelings. And I think that there are a lot of students and other young people that could be really interested in this idea and find pursuit of this really compelling, that, like me, just hadn't had exposure to the idea that reparations was an expansive topic. And so essentially I started my organization called the Amendment Project, which we call TAP for short, which essentially tries to serve the purpose of bringing young people into the conversation about reparations through essentially political advocacy and lobbying city councils, and also just sort of creating educational material and engaging with students online through workshops in classrooms, things like that. And so, so I sort of, it caught my attention one day and I haven't really been able to let it go since then, but very, very grateful as well to be a part of it with everyone here.
Before I move to Ms. Laurent, I just wanted to have you just explain a little bit more about what happened in Evanston, Illinois, because we have a diverse audience and they're coming through different doors to this issue.
Absolutely, sure. So, and again, one of the most exciting things that I've sort of come across in my college career. So essentially Evanston passed the first paid reparations resolution specifically to Black people. And essentially the way it works, it's a housing-based policy. And any Black people who lived in Evanston between, I think it's 1918 and 1969, when the Fair Housing Act was at least, put into practice, are eligible for financial support in securing permanent housing. So, whether that be mortgage support or, whatever that may be, essentially in acknowledgement of the legacy of redlining and the wealth acquisition that Black people were barred from because they weren't allowed to buy houses in non-red district or non-red areas. And so essentially they have I think it's a $10 million fund. And this is also actually available for the descendants of those people as well. But essentially it offers the opportunity for people to pursue permanent home ownership, which again is a huge factor in building wealth. And I think it went into practice. I think it was the final vote was just a couple of years ago. And so that is, that's essentially a little overview
Okay.
of how that works. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Ms. Flora.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I came into this work, there's a lot of resonance between my story and Sydney's story. I grew up in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is a mostly white town, as like the only Black girl in all my classes, part of an interracial family. And there were a lot of things that people said to me, experiences that my family had that were really negative, that I didn't have any sort of language or context or understanding of why that was happening, because I wasn't learning about structural racism in school. And so when I went to college, I studied comparative studies in race and ethnicity, and it was like a whole world opened up to me. And it was actually really like a healing process for me. So I have been doing racial justice work since then. And the long story short is that I started thinking a lot about the kinds of things that we need in this racial justice movement. And I felt like a lot of the current activity is really focused on treating symptoms, which is important. But I started asking myself with a co-founder, I said, like, how do we actually get further upstream and start to address these causes at the root cause level, address these issues at the root cause level? And so we sort of identified wealth disparities and white supremacist narratives as two really strong anchors that are holding our unjust systems in place. And the thinking was that if you could shock the system on those two things, you would see positive ripple effects across all of our other systems. And so reparations became that. And we have a comprehensive definition of reparations. We see it as both financial and non-financial. To Professor Bilmus's point earlier about the UN. But when we got into this work, we started learning more about the field of organizations doing this work. And one of the biggest things that we heard was that it's been just chronically underfunded for a very long time. And so Liberation Ventures, the organization that I co-founded, supports organizations across the country that are doing different forms of truth, reconciliation, and reparations work. Our North Star is to see federal comprehensive reparations, but our entry point is really to sort of nourish the organizations on the ground and help them sort of be building momentum toward that North Star. So we provide funding. We're an intermediary, so we raise and then give out dollars to orgs on the ground. But then we also do non-financial support as well. And then I'll also say, so we believe that it's going to be really important to sort of tell a new story to the country about what reparations is and why repair actually is for everyone and is instrumental in building healthy racial democracy. And so another sort of area of our work is really about narrative change and building the narrative power of the field to actually set the frame for this conversation. So I will also shamelessly say, because I am someone who's like raising dollars to support other organizations, we have supported Sydney's organization, we've supported in Cobra, we've supported Robin Rue Simmons, who was the alderwoman in Evanston, who has now started her own organization. And I want everyone to know in the audience that this organization needs funds. So if you are, and this field needs funds, more importantly. So if you are someone who wants to invest, come and talk to us and we can figure that out.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Drum roll, please. Professor Bilmus, tell us about how you came to the issue of reparations.
Thank you. Very interesting to hear your story, Sydney and Aria. So I came to issue of reparations really because a number of my students, most of my career has been spent focused on military spending and thinking about the cost of wars. I am a Quaker, and like many Americans, after the George Floyd murder, I had spent time in meeting just trying to think about whether there was anything that I might be able to do. And shortly thereafter, a number of my former students came to me and said, look, can you work with us on this issue? And I had said, well, I don't know anything about this issue. And they said, yes, but we want someone, they didn't quite say it this way, but as nerdy and wonky as you, to take a look at this issue and look at at it. And so we spent a year working together with Cornell, trying to examine this issue more analytically, and particularly to examine what were to examine and to refute the objections to reparations. Because the main objections, I've read virtually everything that has ever been written on objections to reparations. And when I say objections, I mean objections by serious people. And the objections are one, that slavery was too long ago, two, that the problem is too big for the government to handle, and three, that it's too expensive. So we, in our paper, I think we have pretty much dispelled those questions. First of all, speaking as a baby boomer, we have certainly documented that most Black baby boomers, in other words, anybody born before 1964, who was a Black American, 1964 being the end of the baby boomer phase, was empirically denied the opportunity to build wealth and probably face discriminatory practices in lending, housing, education, transportation, criminal justice, and healthcare, just to name a few. And so we tried to document some of these harms and in the 20th century and how they had evolved from more original harms to try and connect the pieces, connect the dots to the current day legacy. The second question about that the problem was too big is probably the easiest to refute, because in fact, we process millions of claims every year for individuals including veterans with disability benefit issues and vaccine harmed individuals and people harmed by a wide range of different types of situations. And what the government does, if you look, for example, the Department of Labor budget, that's what the government does. It determines eligibility, it processes claims, it provides money, it figures out the actuarial tables. The government, it's a little bit clunky, but that is really what the federal government does all the time. And when we think about the financial issues, that was probably the most interesting part of the paper to me, being a finance wonk, to see that we really have evolved, along with hundreds and hundreds of programs, many different ways of compensating, of financing these different programs. So, for example, quite a number of programs are paid for through excise taxes. So if you are harmed by a vaccine, for example, say a childhood vaccine, every vaccine manufacturer pays 25 cents per vaccine that is administered per therapeutic area. So say the MMR would be 75 cents. No, sorry, they pay 75 cents per vaccine. So that would be $2.25 for the MMR vaccine. And that goes into a trust fund. So that is the resource that is used to pay out to those who are harmed through vaccines. If you're harmed by the COVID vaccines, there's a whole other program. And one of the things that we discovered in looking at all the programs and the financing is that there are always programs, and then somebody decides that they have identified someone who doesn't fit into the eligibility for that program. So there's another program and another program. So there's a program to compensate the main 100 crops through crop insurance for any kind of harms. And then there's another program to compensate all the crops that are not compensated in the primary program. So between direct reimbursement insurance, which is used very widely. We insure people's bank accounts up to $250,000. We subsidize enormously flood insurance for millions of people. We subsidize heavily and grant crop insurance. We provide a very wide range of kind of insurance mechanisms, which are often financed through banks. We see that there are a lot of creativity. There's a lot of creativity in what can finance different programs of reparatory compensation. So the upshot of all of this is that I feel that this effort needs both the drive and energy and passion of the young people like you to galvanize people to see the moral wrong, but it also needs something else, which is it needs people to begin asking, how is it that we provide reparations for people who are Christmas tree farmers and sardine fishermen and reindeer and emu and elk raisers, and yet the subject that was the greatest moral harm in our history still is not something that, apart from a few isolated pockets, we have a program of reparatory compensation for. And I think that, so in other words, it's going to take the activists and the passion and also the nerds to come together on this.
I love that. You just illustrated language that actually Professor Brooks gave me on how to describe this dilemma. Are reparations radical or routine? And you just described how routine it is to pay reparations. I mean, when you told me about Christmas tree farmers, that just blew my mind. I want to circle, we got our first question, and I want to encourage anyone who is watching to either post questions in the Zoom chat or upload your questions to the app. I have a sheet open and they'll populate if you have something to ask. But I want to circle back to the notion of narrative change that you just talked about, Ms. Florent. I want to just unpack what narrative change means. Is this selling the idea of reparations? Like what is that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And thank you for asking about that, because we do not think about that as selling the idea. And we very explicitly even delineate between sort of like narrative change and like communications and strategic comms and messaging. And the way we think about the difference is that narrative is really about sort of the like collection of stories that then shape our worldviews and the mental models that we have about like how and why the world operates the way it does. And so you could think about, there are deep narratives about the founding of this country, the myth of meritocracy and the bootstrapping narrative and the lost cause narrative that are all actual barriers to us kind of getting to a place where sort of a narrative environment where reparations is really something that folks understand the need for, because we've been taught for so long that actually, oh no, this isn't structural, this is individual. And we know that's not true. And so our work around narrative change is going to be sort of a mix between trying to disrupt those narratives, but then also be ideating with the field about like, what are the new narratives that we need to create and then amplify. And we draw from Rashad Robinson, the president of Color of Change's work on this. Obviously, they're a beautiful narrative change organization. And he talks about the sort of the process of being, learning, creating, broadcasting, and then immersing are these new narratives. And so our work is also going to follow that process. We're in the early days, we're in year 2 of our organization. And so we'll be focused on learning this year, but we'll be really trying to understand, like, what are the narratives that we want to bring forth in this movement? What are the narratives that are going to be really compelling for new audiences so that we're bringing new people into this movement and helping people, and in particular non-Black folks, really see themselves in it and see sort of why this is so important. And I'll just name one other person I think who's been doing that for a long time is Brian Stevenson. When you hear him talk about reparations, he's like, this is not just about folks who are receiving reparations. This is about the folks who, you know, have been sort of implicated subjects in systems that have privileged some and disadvantaged others for 400 years. And all of us actually have to be active agents in the repair, and we all have something to gain from being active in it as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's funny, I've been watching this Twitter discussion between, I believe, journalist Chris Wallace and Nicole Hannah-Jones about the Black experience being foundational to how things have played out in this country. Yes. And some of the people who have been responding to talk about the people holding on to their mythologies, because he could latch on to what she was actually trying to say. So thank you for unpacking narrative change. Sydney, did you want to address that in any sort of, yeah.
Sure, I'd love to jump in, yes. So I think first of all, I just wanted to say, really appreciate what Dr. Bilmus has shared as well, you know, about the practicality of it. I'm very excited to hear more. But I think honestly, the idea of like selling this idea of reparations even betrays some limitations to the way that we're having the conversation about reparations still, with this sort of assumption that we need, you know, that people would need to be coerced into being convinced that this is the way to go about things. And what I have found most interesting in, you know, again, in these few years is that, you know, for example, last summer we co-hosted, or we partnered with the ACLU during their Summer Institute, and we hosted workshops with high school and college students about reparations. And, you know, without fail, every session that we had students stay after, you know, the official session had ended, you know, to say things like, you know, I'd really never thought about this like this. I wasn't really sold on the idea. I'd kind of heard about it, but that made so much sense. And, you know, this I'm really, you know, I really see this in a new way. And, you know, those workshops largely just entailed conversation. You know, we just talked about what happened in this place, and like, how has it affected people to this day, and what can be done about it, and what is the sort of imperative and the obligation to do something about it. So, you know, when it comes to this idea of selling, it's like, for the most part, what we found is that you don't need to sell anyone on it. Like, you need to start the conversation and sort of engage in that conversation. And it's engagement that really develops on its own.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from Danya Lewis, who says, can you talk about the core pillars / criteria for reparations? And does the Evanston, Illinois example meet that criteria? And there's been some debate about that.
There has.
Who would like to take that on?
I mean, I could talk. Dr. Bilmus, do you want to talk about the UN Basic Principles?
It sounds like someone wants to ask. I probably know the least about this particular program. I mean, I would just, my comment on this is just that I don't imagine, if we think about this the way the government thinks about paying reparatory compensation, there isn't just one program. There are different kinds of programs because there are many, many harms. I mean, the harms are interrelated and have grown up. We have in our one of our great students, Hillary Anderson, drew a tree as a way of kind of depicting this, in which the roots were in slavery, and then there were all of the trunk was built up of a lot of different types of things, you know, housing and education, criminal justice, and so on, that kind of interwove and grew into a tree, in which we have, and she took from the song, blood on the roots, blood on the leaves, to show what we have today. Now, things compounded and they interwove, and one way of looking at it is the way my friend Sandy Darity does, which is to say there is a $13 trillion wealth gap. And that is a way of representing all of these compounding types of harms. But there are, when you actually look at and you sort of unpack harms, there are many different kinds of harms and there are many different ways of compensating harms. So, for example, one of Cornell's favorite stories, and a woman I wished I could have met. She sounded like someone who would have been right up my alley, was Callie House, who in 1915 sued for $68 million, which was the amount of cotton tax collected between 1862 and 1868 based on involuntary labor. And she had calculated how much tax the federal government had received based on slave and involuntary servitude cotton. Now, even though that got actually further, that got pretty far along, that proposal. That's sort of another way to think about it, in addition to, say, 40 acres and a mule. But I imagine that a program that works well is going to have many different flavors. So, for example, those who, and once you start to unpack it, I think to a large extent, some of the opposition recedes because people are generally more reluctant to accept a big idea than they are a specific proposal once they sort of hear the logic. For example, thinking about the GI Bill. The GI Bill was the major legislation of the past 100 years that produced the middle class that I grew up in. And my father was a World War II veteran. He was able to go to school on the GI Bill, to buy a house on the GI Bill. Now, there were, in World War II, 8% of those who fought were Black Americans. It was 10% of the Korean War veterans were Black, and almost none of them were able to access the benefits of the GI Bill. That was for a variety of reasons, although Blacks were not explicitly prevented from getting benefits under the GI Bill. The combination of trade union policies, discrimination policies in housing and lending, the fact that the states were given the task of actually implementing the GI Bill, and so many states completely discriminated, the fact that HBCU eligibility were tiny at the time and didn't have many fields of discipline in which to train people. And for all of these reasons, you have studies which show, for example, studies of 66,000 home mortgages awarded in New York. It's not in the South. Only 2 of them were given to Black Americans, in that period. An enormous injustice. But if you think about how to address that particular issue, a bill has been introduced with our encouragement by my former student, Seth Moulton, and Cornell's good friend, Congressman Clyburn and Raphael Warnock, which would pass the benefits of the GI Bill to the descendants of those who fought were discriminated against in those wars. Now, I don't see it as an either or thing, but I see this kind of as an illustration of how we take, because right now, if you are a veteran of the post 9/11 wars and you have the GI Bill, you can pass your unused benefits on to your children. And when you talk to people about this, people tend to say, like, oh yeah, don't we have that already? I mean, the conversation is almost one-sided. Now, whether or not Congress actually passes this, I don't know. But the thinking behind it is thinking which is very, I think, compatible with the idea of thinking that there are many kinds of reparation programs that need to be put in place. And there are many types of harms that need to be compensated. Some are easier to identify the classes than others.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. That's some news we can use too. So we're at time, and so I just want to hear from each of our panelists before we wrap up. I'll give you a prompt, but also you can say basically whatever you want to say to make sure that this issue lands. And I want to revisit Ms. Florent's mention of the fact that repair benefits everyone. We've been asking this question at the Emancipator all week. You know, how does addressing racial injustice benefit the whole? And so I'll start with you, Ms. Scott, and work my way to you, Ms. Florent, and then to you, Professor Bilmus. Oh, Sydney. Okay, yeah.
Sorry. I think that's a really interesting question, because I find that one of the, I guess, sort of barriers, and not barriers, but one of the frameworks that we encounter and that we sort of contend with in talking to students, especially, you know, with people who are, you know, unfamiliar with the idea of reparations. You know, we try to give a lot of space for people to ask messy questions and, you know, sort of, you know, figure things out. And I think one of the interesting sort of frameworks that we have, you know, that we sort of assume is the idea that, and actually Aria brought it up earlier, is the idea of like the implicated subject. You know, so you can sort of think of it as genealogically implicated, you know, people who are, you know, come from a sort of historical ancestral legacy, and also sort of socially or contextually implicated, you know, in terms of how, you know, the systems that you participate in, and, you know, essentially how you are implicated in those systems by, you know, by your participation in them. And, you know, it can sometimes be the kind of conversation that, you know, stems from, you know, for example, you know, my family immigrated to this country, you know, after chattel slavery, after, you know, these specific things. Why should I be a part of this conversation? Why should I be implicated in this conversation? And I think that, you know, so for those conversations, we obviously, you know, we sort of talk about that idea of, you know, the implicated subject. We talk about the idea that reparations is not a punitive act. It is not born out of, you know, punishing someone. You know, it's not trying to sort of the causal mechanism is, or at least sort of the moral causal mechanism is not taking money or, you know, resources away from anyone. It's, you know, it's providing them. And so that idea of, you know, how do you, you know, do I see myself as, you know, needing to think about that and needing to be implicated in that. And I think that there's a lot of room to go beyond that as well. If you think about sort of like what I'm sure Dr. Bilmus can speak to this better than I can, but, you know, sort of what are the financial and economic costs of having, you know, a class of people that are not, you know, that have not been able to build wealth and participate in, you know, in wealth building activities. But also sort of, you know, what does it mean sort of for our, you know, for our culture and society that continued participation in this system is in fact continued participation in, you know, sort of these in the racial wealth gap and in the disparities that have been in practice for so long. And so I think, you know, sort of morally, philosophically, at least how we contend with the world around us, I think it's a really valuable thing, honestly, to be able to implicate yourself in those systems and sort of be able to find benefit and find compassion in wanting to see, in wanting to see debt restored, in wanting to see harm rectified. I think that's something that everyone can genuinely have a stake in.
That's great. Actually, I'm going to go to Professor Bilmus, quick 30 seconds, and then I'm going to wrap up with you, Ms. Florent, okay? All right, Professor Bilmus. The question is being repair for everyone, and you're on mute.
Well, I think that the time is now. We should take responsibility for which is the social norm that we have in this country. We should take responsibility for mistakes that we have made in the past collectively. We should be on the right side of history. And we should also ask ourselves, why is it that we pay reparations to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans we have hundreds of programs paying reparations to millions of Americans for everything but this.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Florent.
I'll jump in, and I want to add to Dr. Bilmus's answer from the last question too. I think as we think about what reparations is, we think about it as sort of four things: reckoning, acknowledgement, accountability, and redress. When we started this work, we asked, what is repair? And we broke it down into those four components. And so redress is obviously the financial compensation pieces, but the reckoning and the acknowledgement and the accountability is also really important, because when we make these, when we compensate people, let's say we do close the racial wealth gap, we're going to have to figure out how to keep it closed. We're going to have to transform our systems to be able to stay vigilant so that it stays closed. And to do that, we actually have to understand the harm. We have to apologize for the harm. We have to hold ourselves accountable for continuing to understand the harm. And so I guess that's what I would say, like, about why is this for everyone? Like, if I harm someone, I want to know that if I don't apologize for that, it's going to eat at me. If I don't understand what harm I caused, it's going to eat at me. And so I just think that that's, we teach our children, like, it's so basic, right? We teach our children, if you hurt someone on the playground, you say sorry, right? And those ideals are currently not being represented in our government. And I think that's, to me, like, why it's for everyone. It's about the alignment with our, like, highest held beliefs about who this country is.
Thank you so much. Well, we're at time, everyone. I just want to say that I've been edified to be in your presence this morning. I want to thank Professor Brooks for making a space for us to convene today, and everyone behind Trotter 150. Thank you, and have a great weekend.
Thanks for having me.
Well, if I could just lift up a word of appreciation for this extraordinary panel on reparations to my co-author, Linda Bilmus, to Aria Florent, who I remember when she came to me, I think before this latest venture, and described a vision that I was certainly sold on from moment one. And to a new colleague in this work, Sydney Scott, who, there are few people your age whose resume so intimidate me. And I just have to say, I'm blessed to hear your comments and be inspired by the work that you have ahead of you. And to Deborah Douglas. Now, again, another shameless plug. The Emancipator, which is in the lineage and legacy of The Guardian, is forthcoming. I don't know the date, but it is forthcoming. So I'm encouraging all of our viewers and all the participants in this convening to look for The Emancipator, to subscribe and to support her work. And I want to thank you for moderating such an extraordinary conversation. And let us note, I believe Aria used, she said, lifted up these words. I believe she said, reparation is not a matter of if, but when, because I believe in my people. Now, I'd love for that to be true for our people, broadly, inclusively defined, meaning every American believes believes when, not if, because we believe in our capacity to come to terms with the past in the present as we reach for the future. So that panel on reparation leaves me hopeful. And I have to believe that all the things that William Monroe Trotter stood for decades ago would stand for today, are represented in what you lifted up, and will be represented in the work that you are bringing forward in this moment. So we want to thank them. Now, we are anticipating the next panel on voting rights, and I just want to lift up for the audience a few things. Please stay tuned for this afternoon's sessions, which focus on, if you will, the policy how of the work that we do, which is to say how to raise funding for social justice advocacy, how to communicate in the context of social justice advocacy, as well as how to organize. So this conference and convening has both been about the policy what, as well as the policy how. And so we ask that you all stay tuned for that. And certainly Carrie Greenwich, the author of the book Black Radical, which is the definitive book on William Monroe Trotter, who she will be speaking to us this afternoon. And so we encourage you to stay tuned for that. So now with that said, we are looking forward to this extraordinary voting rights panel in a few moments. And I will come back to introduce our moderator in but a moment or two. Good afternoon, everyone. It is great to see so many people who are joining in this important conversation on voting rights. As many of you know, we live in a country in which there's a constitution, which, notwithstanding the 15th Amendment or the 26th Amendment or the 19th Amendment, there's not an affirmative right to vote. And we have seen over the years all manner of efforts to take the franchise away from those who sacrificed so much to hold on to it, including the namesake of this conference, that is to say, William Monroe Trotter, who dedicated so much of his life to secure the franchise, the right to vote for Black people. So this conversation on voting rights takes place at a pivotal moment. On Monday, Stacey Abrams has led a fight to protect the right to vote in Georgia. A trial begins on voting rights that is critically important on Monday. On yesterday, on the 150th birthday of William Monroe Trotter, Ketanji Brown Jackson was elevated to the United States Supreme Court. These are momentous times. And so I can't think of a more important conversation or a better person to lead it than an extraordinary journalist and a friend of the work of the Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice in the person of Frederick Whitfield. Now, so many of you know her and watch her on a regular basis. All that being said, it bears repeating for those of you who know her less, her wonderful background. She is an anchor for CNN US, based in the network's headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, where so many of the nation's voting rights fights are taking place. She anchors the weekend edition of CNN Newsroom, and she's an award-winning she's led a award-winning broadcast career that spans more than 30 years. That is absolutely hard to believe. She must have began as a precocious child. Whitfield's reporting ranges from covering stories from the Cuban-Haitian refugee crisis in the 90s to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. She's garnered multiple awards and honors for broadcasting, including the 2005 George Peabody Award for the network's live coverage of Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath, as well as a 2007 Emmy Award for outstanding live coverage of breaking news. Colleagues, friends, it is an absolute joy to welcome Frederick Whitfield, who's been such a great friend and a colleague in this work of covering these kinds of issues. So with that said, Frederica, thank you for doing this, and welcome to this panel.
Thank you, Professor Brooks. I'm so pleased to be here, and we know this is an incredibly vital topic, particularly at this time, and we will be delving into the voting rights of Americans, and we know that this impacts every one of the 133 million Americans who voted in the last general election, and don't we all hope that voter participation is even higher this midterm and the next general election. Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction. You now have an idea of who I am. Let me now introduce our distinguished panel here, and I am going to shorten their titles, not because their credentials are unimportant, but because they are long and distinguished. And of course, all of you in the audience can read up on their backgrounds a little bit later after this discussion. So here we are with the abbreviated titles. Archon Fung, a Winthrop Laughlin McCormick Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. He also co-directs the Transparency Policy Project. Dr. Carol Anderson, Charles Howard Candler Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Emory University, and formerly a member of the U.S. State Department's Historical Advisory Committee. Hamilton Brooks, a senior at New York University studying history and sociology. He is the youth organizer and national strategic campaign manager of Generation Vote, a youth-led organization. Yael Bromberg, Chief Counsel and Strategic Advisor for the Andrew Goodman Foundation, spanning 25 states dedicated to making youth votes and voices a powerful force. She is also a constitutional rights attorney. Thanks for all of you being available and talking this afternoon. So let's begin with this very simple question, but promising very complex answers. So for whom will voting be most difficult this midterm election? Archon, you first.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for Federica and Cornell and everyone else who helped organize this wonderful conference today. I think it's a great question. And if I could take just a couple of minutes, I think voting will be difficult for people, especially living in parts of the country where voting rights are being restricted. So I think there's a big geographic element, and then there is, of course, a large demographic element to it as well. The traditional communities who have found it difficult to vote will, some of them find it more difficult to vote. But there are also bright spots. There are many states that are making voting more accessible to people. If I could, I wanted to take just a couple of minutes. I kind of think of voting rights as fundamental, but kind of a gateway to milestone to a more important, more fundamental steps to a real democracy. I do not think of voting rights as the be all end all of democracy. I think right now there are three really different kinds of challenges to American democracy. And I encourage everybody who's interested in voting rights to think about all three of those challenges. One is the January 6th challenge, right? If January 6th had worked, voting rights would be not that relevant for a whole lot of people, not just traditionally people who've been historically disenfranchised, but lots and lots of people, because an election would have been unsuccessful. So that's the first level, is how do we keep having elections, which we hadn't had to think about for a long time, but I think we really need to think about that now. The second level is about voting rights. How do we make our very flawed democracy somewhat less flawed? And what are the tactical things that we can do to keep it from getting more flawed? And ensuring voting rights and the dignity and respect that goes along with that is important. Independent redistricting is important. Many, many tactical moves, but those won't really get us to a real democracy in which government is responsive to the people and everyone participates and people have political opportunities. For that higher level, we need to do a number of things that are actually impossible in the short term, but necessary in the long term. And this requires dealing with the very substantial malapportionment in Congress. You know, right now, the most populous state is about 180 times more populous than the least populous, but each of them gets 2 senators. The Electoral College is an institution that nobody outside of the United States even understands, and it's hard to explain it to them. So we have a rickety constitution that is preventing majority rule, and things like voting rights. Everybody who fights for voting rights needs to fight harder for voting rights, but needs to take on these struggles that are impossible in the short term, but necessary in the long term. I just want to end by saying that in 1950, getting voting rights for African Americans in the South was one of these tasks that was impossible in the short term, but absolutely necessary for the survival and thriving of American democracy in the longer term. And so right now, it's not that. It's a matter of preservation and expansion. But you don't have to look back many years for people who really fought hard for democracy, taking on these challenges that just seemed insurmountable, but worked really, really hard over many years to create a democracy that we can believe in.
So then, Dr. Anderson, perhaps by extension of one of the points that Arshawn was making and asking the question of how do we as a nation ensure voting rights, especially when you have now 19 states that have enacted voting restrictions in 2021, and this happening in mostly Republican-led legislatures, now leading to 34 laws. So I wonder, Dr. Anderson, how did we even get here?
Like Graham Central Station said, it wasn't on our own. How we got here was frankly, through the Southern strategy. The Southern strategy coming out of really the late 1950s, 1960s was about moving the Southern Democrats, those folks who had been ardently opposed to Black folks' civil rights, into the Republican Party. And so just as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65 had basically put the power of the federal government behind enforcing African-American civil rights, you had the party that had been discredited for their blocking of that being welcomed into a legitimate Republican Party. They took that party over. The toxin of white supremacy took that party over and then added an aura of legitimacy that led us into the Shelby County v. Holder decision of 2013, that Supreme Court decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act, that gutted pre-clearance of the Voting Rights Act. And the moment that was gutted, you had these Republican states just rushing to the doors to implement voter suppression laws, because what they were doing is that they were targeting the folks that they knew would not vote for them. So they targeted African Americans, they targeted Hispanics, they targeted indigenous people, they targeted Asian Americans, they targeted poor folk, they targeted the youth. And in those targeting from these policies that looked legitimate on their surface, that's part of what we have to understand. It always has this aura of legitimacy behind it, but all you have to do is pull back the veil and you see the little Wizard of Oz pulling on those little levers, really creating you see what's really happening behind the scenes there. So you hear we have to protect election integrity. We have to stop all of this massive rampant voter fraud. There's no massive rampant voter fraud. That has been documented over and over, but it becomes the mantra that then provides the cover for these laws like voter ID, for like massive voter roll purges, for shutting down polling stations in Black and poor communities, for a number of these laws that for absentee ballots, for reducing drop boxes, all of these things which are designed to give the aura of protecting election integrity, but are actually designed to prevent African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, poor folk, and young folk from accessing the ballot box. That's how we got here.
So Yael, I see you nodding your head, and just to kind of summarize what Dr. Anderson is saying, the consequence of what most proponents see as a hugely successful general election, the consequence now is you have a division of how it is interpreted. You have on one side an argument of voter suppression, while the other is talking about voter expansion. How do you see it?
I think that's right, and that there's just a false narrative being presented that that we have to compromise election security, and this vague notion of what public confidence in our electoral system means. So when these laws are being introduced, they're being introduced, and there's about three main reasons for them that are justifications. One is voter fraud, which has been very well established to be a myth. Actually, the 2020 Trump litigation, more than 100 times that myth was essentially an audit on the system, and it found that the system worked. That more than 100 times the court showed that actually there was no big lie, that the election was secure and safe. And federal agencies in the US, including under the Trump administration, acknowledged that this was a safe and secure election. Yesterday, I was speaking with the US Election Assistance Commissioner, Ben Hovland. He said this is the safest election he had ever seen in his career. And that's true, because we saw unprecedented voter turnout. We saw 17 million more people drive to the polls compared to the last presidential election. Young voters, first election in which the majority of voters under the age of 30 participated. And of course, as you know, Frederica, the response to this is voter suppression, this notion that there's a myth of voter fraud, but that is just a false construction. It is just an anthem. It is a rally call. It's a dog whistle. And as I said earlier, what does it mean for us to have public confidence in our electoral system? When Crawford was decided by the United States Supreme Court, which was the first decision to uphold a photo ID requirement, unfortunately, based on very thin facts that were presented, because it was a new concept then. And when Crawford was upheld, the courts were very persuaded by this idea of voter fraud, election integrity, protecting the public confidence in our elections. But I think that the 2020 election has proved that the public is confident in our electoral system. We had an essential audit through the judiciary. We had unprecedented voter turnout and participation. And so these ideas of why we're in a place now where 250 voter suppression laws were introduced or pre-filed immediately after the election, a 7 times higher rate in 43 states. Well, we know what that is. That's a response to voter turnout and a affirmation of our belief in democracy. And I think that the question now is, how do we continue that? And as you know, there are all these new voter suppression laws being introduced. And in the meantime, there's 71 active cases taking place right now in 21 states, as well as the District of Columbia, fighting against those laws.
So Hamilton, are young people confident about voting? Are they as engaged in the fight for voting rights as they are engaged, and we're seeing young people are very engaged in the climate crises, other issues of concern? Is it on equal footing, voting rights, climate, crises, social issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there's a bit of nuance to it in the sense that I think in terms of, I'm not going to argue, I'm a youth voting rights organizer. I'm not going to argue here that youth voting rights is a mass movement in the way that climate is, because it's just simply not. But also at the same time, I think it's really important to point out that young people really do care about elections, and young people are not apathetic to elections. This has been something that's been continuous throughout history. I mean, speaking very honestly, like, young people volunteer a lot more than the people who vote a lot more than we do. And then, we're also just more civically engaged. The young people are the people out there protesting more than any other age group. And so when you see those things together, the picture becomes more clear that young people are a group that are uniquely impacted by systemic and institutional processes that are put in place so that they're disinterested, that are trying to make them disinterested in voting. I mean, you think about the fact that out of all age groups, candidates are least likely to reach out to young people. You think about the fact that, in New York, where I'm going to school, like, the NYC BOE has done shockingly little in terms of voter engagement with high schoolers, in terms of really preparing them to vote in elections. I mean, we see the decline of civic education ever since young people were given the right to vote in the 70s. Like, as soon as that happened, civics education in classes went down and has gone down continuously. And so when you see those things all coming together, you get a group of young people who are really interested in all the issues that are on the ballot, but who aren't always voting. But we've seen, even in cases, even with all the suppression going on, that young people have voted, and voted significantly over the past few elections.
So that's interesting, Archon, because historically we talk about the 50s and the 60s, civil rights movement, voting rights led by young people. John Lewis, Andy Young, they were in their early 20s and some of them in their late teens, to Hamilton's point. And the young people today are still engaged. So then how do candidates, how does anyone get people of all ages equally engaged in the fight for voting rights, just like they might be for the climate crises, or either perhaps some social issues, the fight against inequities, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. There was a great political observer from a couple of decades ago who said that people fight really hard for the right to vote, but once they get the right to vote, they don't actually use it all that much, right? That really, it's the fervor and it's the disrespect associated with the inability to vote that drives, and rightly so, it's deeply disrespectful, that drives demands to get the vote. And with the leaders that you're talking about, I think that, I guess I would favor, there are many measures, right, that would get voters of all ages to turn out. I think an important one is to create parties and politics that people really are excited about. And I think the two-party system is a real disservice to that. People have all sorts of desires. The United States is one of the only two countries in the world with two effective parties. Everybody else had more. Imagine if you had, the Trump wing, but the non-Trump wing, and the AOC and Bernie wing, along with the Biden wing. If all those people had different parties, I believe it would really mobilize a lot more people to turn out, because they'd have somebody to vote for that they really believed in. I also am intrigued by a book that recently came out by my colleagues E.J. Dion and Miles Rappaport, suggesting universal civic duty voting. What if we adopted the Australia or the Brazil system, in which everybody had a duty to vote? So right now in the United States, even in this great year, right, 2020, of record voter turnout, our voting age population turnout was 65% of the voting age population. And even if you waved a wand and got rid of all this voter suppression, how much would that go up? Maybe 70%, maybe. But, looking comparatively, we're at the bottom of the barrel. We're about 30 out of 35, near the bottom of the list in terms of the proportion of our folks that turn out to even a general election. right? So I think we really need a lot of work to do there.
That's a big problem. So Yael, I recall hearing you say, people who are choosing not to vote or throwing in the towel are privileged. And this is not about black or white, but they are squandering a right that obviously was hard fought. Either they don't know it or they don't care. Can you elaborate on that thought?
Well, this was in response to actually a student asking me, my vote doesn't count. And so isn't it okay for me not to vote as a result of that? And so my response to that was, no, that's a response based on privilege, that you assume that your vote doesn't count, maybe because you have power elsewhere. And so you don't feel a direct repression. As Archon described, you've maybe got enfranchisement, got the right to vote, but you don't feel the need to go to the actual ballot box, or you're completely disillusioned and you're trying to create alternate systems elsewhere. Like, young people are increasingly independently minded. They're investing in startups and co-ops and new ways of living in a different way. And it's a matter of how do we pull them into the system? And the fact of the matter is that their vote actually does matter. Look at what happened yesterday. We had a historic nomination onto the United States Supreme Court. Where did that come from? That came from Georgia, where 1 out of 5 voters was a youth voter, and they drove to the polls. Let me tell you, in Bard College is a liberal school 45 minutes north, blue Empire State, right? We fought for them to be able to have a polling place on campus. 70% of the students in the district, 70% of the voters in the district are students. Year after year, we fought and we secured their ability to have an on-campus polling location. That sent a chord throughout the state of New York. And yesterday, we heard news that the state of New York included in their budget a mandate which amended the state election law to require polling places to be put on college campuses. I did a survey of this. I found that only 50% of college campuses that I surveyed provided an on-campus polling location on election day. And that's a local measure that we can use. So we have to really think outside of the box, especially, the youth voters. They got enfranchised. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary year of the ratification of the 26th Amendment. And in many ways, we don't consider them a protected class, although I believe that they're a unifying class, because people across the spectrum, we all acknowledge that we were, God willing, young once, God willing, age, right? So it's a protected class. And there are so many ways in which we can invest in those voters. And the win in New York through organizing and advocacy and litigation, the win in Georgia that secured that through democracy, we were able to change our justice system. These are very concrete ways in which, and we have to continue to communicate this and celebrate our wins, because I believe that democracy begets democracy, and we have to continue. We can't have a fall off of 2020 just because we had an existential threat of authoritarianism, that voter turnout does not continue to be the norm. We've now modernized our systems. That can't only have been a temporary response to a pandemic. We have to keep up.
Dr. Anderson, you're in Georgia, and I saw you nodding a lot, so I'm just going to press go. Say what's on your mind.
It was the incredible organizing over the span of a decade. I mean, so this is part of what we have to see. Georgia flipped. They went, wow, look what they did that year. No, this was over a decade of organizing, and it was multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational organizing, understanding the power of this democracy. And it was working with people to say, what do you want? And having people respond, I want good schools. I want affordable health care. I want to have a hospital in my rural area. I mean, it was listening to those folks and then tying in the power of the vote and the power of our representation in order to meet the people's needs. And it was in the runoff election, the Senate runoff election in January of 2021, Black voter turnout was almost 92%. I mean, that is like phenomenal. But the response has been, did you see Black folks come out and vote? oh my gosh, how do we stop this from happening again? So this is what I call that white rage, that backlash to African Americans' advancement towards their citizenship rights. And it's the policy backlash. So we see it in SB 202. We see it in the kinds of voter suppression laws that are happening around this nation. And we deal with it by saying, we cannot treat 2020 as if we just won the Super Bowl. We got a first down. We have got to keep fighting because these repressive measures, the threat of authoritarianism has not abated. What we see in these new laws is a twofold piece. One is to go after how do we lower the access to the ballot box for a range of folk. And the other one is how do we lower the guardrails of democracy that kept Trump from overturning the will of the people in 2020? So how do we lessen the power of the Secretary of State? How do we lessen the power of the certification of the vote? How do we determine who's certifying those votes so that they have the power to just erase what the electorate wanted? And so that's why we have to fully engage and continue to be engaged so that we can protect this democracy.
So in addition to those things, Hamilton, what are the young people saying? I mean, what are the young people saying about universal voting? What are they saying about online voting, or perhaps even other suggestions on how to make voting safe, if not infallible altogether, or safer?
Yeah, so I think Carol brought up a lot of really great points in terms of Georgia, and I think Georgia is a perfect example because there were really two things that I thought were really strong in terms of their advocacy over a decade, and it was that they were truly like prepared, and they were truly prepared in a way that we really haven't necessarily seen in other areas. I mean, we think about the reaction to the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act failing, and sort of now all the attention shifting to the local level and state level. And it's like, no, that should have been there earlier. And then also the fact that comms the communication was centered towards young people. But sort of to the question around online voter registration in AVR, I think in terms of where the opinion is and the approval is, I think it's in a strong place. And I think young people are behind it. But I think we have to be really, really wary of the other side and people against these ideas putting money into it. I mean, bringing up New York recently in the last election voted on a number of measures which would have opened up access to the ballot. I mean, we're talking about pre-registration, online voter registration, automatic, and these ballot measures lost despite approval before being in favor. And this is because Democrats didn't really put much money into it. So we're in a position where there is approval, but we have the other side and people who are working really, really hard to shift that. And I think when voting rights is not necessarily a mass issue, these sort of misinformation campaigns can become extra, extra powerful.
Yeah, well, the misinformation campaigns have only become more emboldened, have they not? And I think it seemed foreign, perhaps 2 general elections ago, and now it's become the norm. Yael, what's the arsenal against the misinformation campaigns that seem to be winning larger support, making it harder for a lot of people to vote, because it is what's helping to propel a lot of these new pieces of legislation that perhaps that big voter turnout, that voter expansion was too much. And as opposed to it being an opportunity for more people to vote, especially during a pandemic.
I think the arsenal is more organizing and more conversations like these about the power that we have on the local level, statewide, and federal level. We can't wait for the Freedom to Vote Act to come out. I mean, we have to maintain the pressure, but we can't just be advocating and making phone calls there. We have to continue to do the local work, for the young people working with their county registrars to bring polling places on campuses. On the state level, ensuring student voter identification forms can be valid forms of of ID. Hamilton talks about the failure of election day registration to pass. Do you know EDR did not pass in New York? It's still languishing in New Jersey. I mean, these are blue states, and election day registration is not an administrative burden. There's no administrative burden shown. You're simply doing your job, which you would do before the voter registration deadline. But now, because we have the availability of technology and the voter registration forms are not simply paper forms that you go and secure into like a physical filing cabinet, right? You can check your GPS online. You should be able to register to vote on the same day. That is secure. And by the way, these are measures that it's not just the Republican Party. We're talking about blue states here. On the local level, we can be doing a lot more. This does not have to be an adversarial process. And this is why I really love the lens that the youth vote specifically offers, because it's a unifying piece. When the amendment was ratified 50 years ago, it's the most recent voting rights amendment to be ratified in US history. And it's the quickest amendment overall to be ratified. Why? It passed the Senate unanimously, the House almost unanimously. President Nixon signed it into law. And what he said during his certification ceremony, President Nixon, he said that young people serve a high moral purpose because a nation always goes through ebbs and flows of idealism, and young people will be the check on that. So what does that mean? It means that young people are critical for the actual practice of democracy. And young people, we're not talking about partisanship there. And so this is something that we have to lay and hold accountable on the local, state, and federal level and across party lines. When I speak with Republican parents, they don't want their children to be disenfranchised. I really believe that this is a unifying notion if we talk about empowering youth. And I think that, I hope, maybe it's overly optimistic, but I hope that when we talk about youth and we look at, as was mentioned earlier, youth leadership, youth helped to write the story of America. It was our founders, right? Frederick Douglass, he was 21 years old. Alice Paul, all these people, they were young, right? They were young when they wrote the US Constitution, when they wrote new constitutions into our ratification process. And yet we continue to perpetuate this myth that young people are apathetic, that they're not engaged, but they continue to lead today just like they always have. And I really believe that we just have to focus there, invest there, and go beyond, try to work beyond partisanship. These are really cross-partisan issues that are just about democracy.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about what we think is next. And then I believe we are going to be able to open it up for questions from our audience. So Hamilton, not to put the weight on you and your generation, the younger generations, but what do you think the hope is on the fight for voting rights? How might the next generation, young people, take it to the next level?
I'm so excited you asked me that question. Thank you.
I'm excited to hear your reply.
But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that we can be doing. I mean, I think about the way I thought about the voting space, with my grandparents, a lot of the discourse around voting rights was going on in barbershops, it was going on in salons, it was going on in community centers, it was going on in churches. And now I think about, you contrast that with today. And I think, unfortunately, something we need to do better on is a lot of that discourse is now, you can only get access to that discourse if you have a JSTOR subscription or you have a subscription to the Times. So I think it's like really important that moving forward, that especially in terms of youth voting rights, that it becomes a space that is not just youth who are in college, but it's young people who are outside of college. And we really start to center the conversation more so on young people of color who are not in college, because these are truly some of the most people, when you asked the first question about people most vulnerable to voter suppression, that was the group I was going to name, a young person of color who is not in college. And I think the other side of it is honestly the way that, youth voting rights is going about communications, our communication with not just media, but the way that we promote ourselves on social media. I think other movements, other mass movements, I mean, I look at a group like Sunrise, for example, are doing a really great job of pushing over social media and understanding the landscapes that they're a part of and using that in order to absorb people into the movement so that you can get young people a part of these campaigns, because these voting rights organizations, they're doing the work and they have the campaigns, but we need the young people there, and we need to reach out to where they are in order to get these interested people involved and truly engaged.
Right. And like you said, like a variety of young people, they are not some monolithic being. So, Archon, America has its new justice in Ketanji Brown Jackson. So the U.S. Supreme Court is likely to still have the same, 6-3 leaning on voting legislation. But what, if anything, are you anticipating in the near term?
Well, I think on a bunch of these democracy issues, the Supreme Court is pretty kind of taking a knee, so to speak. So I think that at the court level, it's moving, as we see, to the state courts and state constitutions. And I think there's going to be a lot of action there. I think looking forward, I mean, the state that we're in is bad with regard to voting rights and even norms about voting. But I think just 5 or 10 years ago, if you'd asked most people in America, like 80% probably would have said, yeah, more Americans voting is a good thing, right? And that's changed now in not a good way. So it wasn't that long ago, right? Barely a blink. So how do you get back there? So the norm, and I think the bumper sticker that I'd like everyone to walk away with is, voters need to pick the politicians, not the other way around. And so mucking around with voting rights and accessibility and gerrymandering is politicians trying to pick their voters, which is backward in a democracy. And then the last thought is, I think people should be attentive to new threats on the horizon. January 6th was certainly one of those. I think Yael and Carol and Hamilton can talk a lot to this, I imagine. I think we're going to see more political violence in the months ahead. And we see that very clearly in the intimidation of election officials and on social media and their families being threatened. I think we need to just say, in America, we don't do that. We do not threaten public officials with intimidation. It doesn't matter what your views are, but physical threats and violence are off the table. And we just need to make a bright line there.
Well, then to that point, Dr. Anderson, looks like you're about to say something. I wonder, how do you instill confidence in the voting public, or perhaps even politicians, to say, we're going to be able to vote without great bodily harm or risk? If the tone is now being set, as Archon was saying, that there's potentially more of that on the horizon, what can be done now to restore the confidence in people and the freedom to vote without facing violence potentially?
So I'm going to come at that through the other way. Right now, I see that our democracy is under a land, sea, and air attack. The land attack is the assault on voting rights. And we see this through all of the voter suppression laws. We see this through the lowering of the guardrails of democracy, so that the certification can be done by those who have a vested interest in a certain outcome. The sea attack is the washing away of the teaching of real American history, so that we see all of these anti-civil right, anti-CRT bills. All of these will not teach divisive topics. And so what that does is it creates an electorate that has no idea how we got here. And it creates an electorate that believes, and when I call the Rick Santorum School of History, that Europeans came to this empty land and built it all by themselves, which allows then for a framework of makers and takers. And so that Europeans were the ones who made the United States. Therefore, they're the only viable ones who have the access to the resources. Everybody else is a parasite on this society. When you see policy framed in that way, it's because you've got a myth history going on. And the air attack is the loosening of the gun laws that we have seen in multiple states, along with the concept that what we saw on January 6th, as the RNC said, was legitimate political discourse. And so when you make violence legitimate political discourse while you are loosening gun laws, it means that those whom you oppose politically are subject to that violence. Reuters did that incredible listing of the threats to election workers, where they were saying, hey, we're going to use our Second Amendment rights to take you out. What we need to see is the political backbone to say, we are not doing this. And there are consequences. One of the greatest threats to American democracy has been to allow white supremacy to run wild without being held accountable for the damage that it does to American democracy. We saw this in the founding of this nation when South Carolina was like, no, we are not arming Black folk. We would rather surrender to the British. We saw this when they were holding the Constitution hostage, saying we want to have the 3/5 clause or we will walk away. We want to have the fugitive slave clause or we will walk away. We saw this with the Civil War. We saw this during the Cold War, which was when the US was trying to do its strut around the world as the world's greatest leading democracy, but you're looking at Emmett Till, you're looking at Birmingham, and you can't make that make sense. And when there are no consequences, and right now we're looking at January 6th, the world was absolutely appalled and shocked when they saw those images about what was happening on the Capitol. Folks have to be held accountable. When we have accountability, consequences in the system, that is how you begin to reinstill confidence that our democracy will hold.
Yael, do you see that a new level of accountability on the horizon to break that cycle that she just described?
I wish I saw it more. I wish I could say that I see it, but I don't. I think that people are scared, and I think there's like a shell shock happening because it's just so hard. You know, during the Trump administration, every day was a new horror, right? Every day felt like a year. And then of course we had that like death spiral that took place also. And so that's actually a degree of political violence also. So we're just coming out, I think. I don't know that we're really awake to what's happening. And I think that Professor Anderson hits the nail on the head when she says there's got to be consequences. Where are the consequences? Where's the accountability? You know, the Bar Association, we have to strip the licenses of these attorneys that dared to take the cases on election eve, right? That had no evidence of that and just drummed up this misinformation campaign that people are now feeding into. It can't be simply an excuse that they're introducing these voter suppression laws under this like ambiguous concept of public confidence in the election system, because you created the public lack of confidence in the election system. So absolutely, we need to have this accountability. We need people to lose their licenses. We need people to go to jail. We need people to be, you know, you can't just storm. You know, it's really remarkable. I was doing legal observation with my green hat in Washington, D.C., the first day of the Trump inauguration. And there was a mass arrest that took place. I don't know if people realize over 200 people were mass arrested and threatened with 65 years in jail under this crazy notion of conspiracy, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm not making an exaggeration. This happened, and they were, you know, they had to be dragged into court. They had to go under this ongoing prosecution simply because they were participating in the right to dissent. And I don't see that type of response to these individuals that, you know, stormed the Capitol, right? Like they threatened death of our elected representatives. I mean, I think we need to wake up. I think we need to really wake up. And the thing is that it is our elected representatives. Jamie Raskin is doing such a wonderful job. He's really, you know, the leadership is really incredible right now, but we need the people to be moving on this, right? Like they need to be hearing from us, and we all need to wake up, because it's true. We're just going to continue to have this cycle. How do we get through this, right? How do we, as Arundhati Roy said, how can we use the pandemic as a portal and get to the point of election modernization, to get to the point of democracy through this crisis, instead of fall back on this status quo and kind of lull back to sleep? I think that's really the challenge ahead of us.
Okay, let me see if we have some questions coming from the audience now. And we're still trying to figure out how we're supposed to retrieve those questions. We know they're out there. Let's see here. Are we receiving them on the same format? Oh gosh. Somebody's gonna have to send us a smoke signal, because
they are in the chat. There are a good number of them in the chat box.
Okay, well, I wish we could get to that here.
I can read them to you if you want.
Okay. Okay, I see a little chat there. Ooh, oh boy, the print is tiny. Yes, go ahead. Go right ahead, Professor.
No. From Claudia Withers, what is the role of the media in assessing the challenges to voting rights that the panel describes? Is there too much whataboutism?
Who wants to tackle that first?
I think that part of what we're seeing is a media model that is the clickbait model, and that is the race. You know, it's a race. So for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, it was a failure for the Democrats and it was a win for the Republicans, but not that it was a failure for American democracy. And so it is the framing of what these battles are, that when the framing is this horse race thing, instead of American democracy is losing, the people are losing, the citizens are not having access to the ballot box, then when we don't get that framing and we get that it is just these voting rights battles are partisan battles, that is part of the danger that is out there. It is the unwillingness to accept what is really going on. And I really believe that part of what we're seeing is the drug of American exceptionalism, the kind of sense that, oh, this democracy has been here for years. It's the world's longest democracy. It's the world's greatest democracy. And yes, we've had a couple of blips, but this thing can't turn into what has happened in these other places because we're America. And yes, it can happen here. And we need the media to be very clear. It is happening here.
It's another way of looking at that point, Yael, you made earlier about privilege. There's an assumption that people feel like, no, this is just a moment. Surely we're going to get back to normal, and our normal, what we know is things are going to stay together. We're going to all hold it together, but it's very fragile. And I think what we've seen in recent months and years, I mean, it hasn't been long, right, to see the fragility of democracy in this nation. You got another question there, Professor?
I do indeed.
Okay.
There's a question: how do people in blue states help secure voting rights for people in other areas? I'm not sure if that's a blue state versus red state. How do people in blue states help secure voting rights protection for people in other areas, presumably red states?
Yeah. So Carol, what do you want people like me in Massachusetts do to help out people in Georgia?
Send money. And also to really help with the framing of the narrative. Because part of what is so powerful and corrosive is that these ideas of voter suppression eddy up all throughout the United States. I mean, so it is what Yael was talking about in terms of the blockage in New York, in terms of some just basic access to the ballot box. So it's you fighting for it there helps us fight for it here.
Help me understand what you mean when you say send money. I mean, what does that money go? What does that help finance?
Thank you. It goes to the organizations that are on the ground, who are working in these communities, who are working in the Latino communities, who are working in the Asian American communities, who are working in the Hispanic communities, who are working in the Black communities, who are working in the rural areas and in the urban areas, who are knocking on doors, who are sitting down meeting with folks. I mean, this is labor intensive work. And it is necessary work. It is the work of democracy. It is not free. And the other side has big dark money writing huge checks. We need to balance that off there are more people than there are money, there is money. When you get enough people voting, you can in fact begin to change the narratives and the policies in this nation.
And just to break it down even further, because I think a lot of times as soon as they hear dollar signs, they glaze over. So it may not necessarily mean paying for people's paychecks, because a lot of people are volunteering. You're talking about the money is then transferable to resources like gas. How do you get there? How do you get to knock on someone's door, if not to get there, whether it's the bus, public transportation, or gas money? Can you break it down even further for people to understand? When they hear money, they might freak out a little bit and thinking it's lining somebody's pockets, but help people understand.
Folks aren't living large. Folks are doing the work. So Georgia has 159 counties. To be able to set up and operate in those 159 counties, you need to know where people are. You need to know where they live. You need to know if they have voted regularly or not. You need to know all of this stuff when you begin knocking on their doors and talking with them. You need to be able to get there. You need to have, you need to be able, when folks are working all day, they need to be able to eat. I mean, it's a little thing, but it's a big thing. It's the kinds of basic structures of being able to organize and do the work. When you think about the civil rights movement, we herald that as this great moment where the United States had its come to Jesus meeting. That took money. That took money for the structures where they slept. It took money for being able to drive around Mississippi. It took money to be able to do that. None of this is free. Democracy is not free.
Professor, probably, I'm looking at the clock, maybe have time for maybe 3.
I think there's time for just one more question, which is, how do we move young people from protests to the polls? How do we move young people from protests to the polls? I take it that's a question about how to activists to vote.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's a single unique path, but I think what I would say is that personally, in terms of my path, I think the best way to do that is helping young people to feel empowered in the communities that they're working in. So I think for me, a big part was feeling empowered on my campus in order to make changes in terms of getting a early voting site on campus or getting election day off. Those were the things that made me feel power. And I think with young people in particular, we're fighting against, and I want to distinguish this from apathy. I think we're fighting against this idea that I've been hurt so much institutionally and systemically by these systems that I'm just so hurt and traumatized by it, but I can't do anything more. And so by helping people feel empowered, and by that, I mean sort of working in your own local communities in terms of working maybe with your local BOE or working on a state level campaign. I'll give an example of one campaign that my organization, our organization, Jim Vote, is doing. We're running this program called Ascenders, and in this program, we're putting young people on Secretary of State elections across the country. And so things like that give young people the opportunity to actually gain experience and to not just be like, because we always hear, go vote, go vote, go vote. But then by actually working on these campaigns, you can actually learn why it's important, and you can really feel your impact. And I think that's what young people need, to feel like their voice truly matters and that they have an opportunity for impact.
Can I ask a question, Hamilton? Talking to friends of mine who are working on youth movements and, on this protest to voting, my friend is finding one framing that really, it's not protest or voting. Like in an earlier age, we thought, well, there's people who work the outside game and then there's inside system people who vote. She says, no, it's like protest and voting. So if you're working on climate or any of these, or guns or any of those other issues, if you're an activist, 95% of your effort is on the outside game where it should be, but it's not that hard to go vote. And it probably help, maybe 0.5%. So why not do that too? So protest and voting, maybe, does that fit, or does that think, no, that's not the right way to think?
No, I totally think that fits. And I mean, especially, as we're thinking about, trying to make voting rights a mass movement, especially for young people, that's absolutely necessary in terms of linking voting rights to other movements that young people are really, really engaged in. So I absolutely agree.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, this has been an incredibly enriching hour. Thank you so much for everyone's input. I hope, Professor Brooks, this equips a lot of people who are listening and watching with perhaps some new tools on how to secure our voting rights in America, and perhaps new ideas on how to combat any other obstructions that are coming our way, because we know we have not seen it all. And let's hope at the very least, it'll inspire people to vote like they've never done before.
So if I could just lift up a word of appreciation to the moderator and to all of you as panelists. There are a great many things that we will discuss over the course of these 2 days, but this is the most important, because obviously voting rights is foundational for all of the issues that we are working on. And one of the things that Yael reminded me of that I think is particularly relevant for this panel, the advocacy for the youth vote goes back to World War II, with the notion being that if you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to be able to vote. And so certainly that was true of World War II veterans, young men, and Vietnam veterans, young men. But in this moment, the people who are taking the most risk in our democracy and who are fighting the hardest oftentimes in our democracy are young people on the front lines of social justice. So if they're old enough to fight in terms of activism, it should be that we are old enough, mature enough to secure their right to vote, along with the other kinds of democratic rights and privileges that we've discussed on this panel. So we're just extraordinarily grateful for your expertise, for your experience. And Frederica, to your point about education, the whole point of this convening, right, is to equip activists and advocates with real tools, right? So in other words, talking about voting rights, leveraging the scholarship of Yael and Carol and Archon, but also leveraging the expertise of activists in this moment, so that they're able to engage in what we call multilingual advocacy, law, policy, economics, morality, ethics, multi-level, different levels, state, federal, local, and multi-generational. And I think we saw some of that on this panel. So we are deeply, deeply grateful. Thank you for your work, and we look forward to seeing you in the work of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Yay.
Thank you so much, Frederica.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
So we are looking in our afternoon session. We have 2 in-person sessions and 2 remote sessions. So just as by way of reminder, we have a session beginning at 1 o'clock, 2 in-person, 2 remote. And these are advocacy skills building workshops, one of which is called Lift Every Voice Using Media to Amplify the Movement. Using media to amplify the movement, that is to say, lift every voice. And that will be a session at 1 o'clock, and that will be here on the campus of Harvard. And then at 2 o'clock, we have Funding the Unpopular to Defeat the Unjust. Funding the Unpopular to Defeat the Unjust. And we have that session beginning at 2:30. So we're asking everyone to come back for the session at 1 o'clock and to take a moment to have lunch, but be sure to rejoin us. And you can view this convening, of course, on Hoover, but also on Facebook, also on Twitter, and certainly YouTube. So please continue to celebrate with us the legacy of William Monroe Trotter, and continue to learn and study about the ways in which we can fund our movements, communicate about our movements, and do the work in this time. And let me also note that in the afternoon at 4 o'clock, we will have a book talk from Carrie Greenwich on the life of William Monroe Trotter. So, and let me, colleagues, before you sign off for lunch, I just want you to just hold on for just one moment. You recall back in 1914, William Monroe Trotter goes to the White House with a group of Black advocates and activists. They meet with the President of the United States, President Woodrow Wilson. In the course of this meeting, William Monroe Trotter confronts President Wilson over his unwillingness to stop the segregation of the federal workforce. He confronts President Woodrow Wilson. President Woodrow Wilson tries initially to sidestep the questions, to avoid the issue, to duck the issue. But William Monroe Trotter confronts the president, so much so severely, if you will, that the President of the United States says that he takes offense and finds offensive the tone of Trotter. Trotter is promptly kicked out of the White House and in fact banned from the White House. And so in this moment, in 2022, we have Ambassador Mark Green, who is the CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is a federally established center for scholars studying international relations and diplomacy and diplomatic service. And so we have a video from the CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center speaking to the legacy of President Woodrow Wilson and the legacy of William Monroe Trotter. This is well worth watching. Take a look at this video and we will certainly see you at 1. But please hold on and take note of this video with these words from Ambassador Green.
Hello everyone, I'm Ambassador Mark Green, President and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Congress first established the Wilson Center in 1968 as a memorial to America's 28th president. Since then, in line with that charter, the center has explored in depth Wilson's legacy as a statesman and foreign policy visionary. But of course, there's another side to his legacy, a side that I promised we'd be more open about when I joined the center last year. No real analysis of President Wilson is honest if it doesn't confront his record of racism. So we're working to highlight the life and leadership of William Monroe Trotter, both to honor an important figure in the American Civil Rights Movement and examine the racism of our 28th president and his times. Before becoming president, Wilson expressed racist beliefs during his scholarly career, minimizing the evils of slavery and criticizing the architects of Reconstruction. As U.S. president, Wilson was too slow to condemn the epidemic of lynching that raged across the South. He also appointed several segregationists to senior positions in the government. Perhaps most notably, Wilson presided over the expanded segregation of the federal service. That involves separating federal employees by race, firing numerous black officials, and restricting black people's opportunities for employment and advancement. These policies served to reinforce the rising tide of Jim Crow laws in the South. They also cemented inequality in the nation's capital, which was at the time home to a thriving black middle class. In 1914, Trotter courageously confronted Wilson right in the White House and denounced permitting segregation of the federal workforce as a humiliation. Wilson responded by defending his policies as preventing racial friction. He declared himself offended by Trotter's tone and ejected Trotter from the White House. This confrontation was historically significant because it featured two important figures in American history arguing over two very different views of what was right. History tells us Woodrow Wilson was ahead of his time in speaking to human and political rights in the international realm. Toward the end of World War I, he was an outspoken proponent of self-determination, and he was a lead architect of the League of Nations, the predecessor to the UN. History also tells us that in other ways, darker ways, he wasn't ahead of his time. Instead, he was riddled with contradictions and, yes, racism. And that confrontation with Trotter was an important moment that exposed Wilson's hypocrisy and America's. Of course, Trotter's legacy is about much more than Woodrow Wilson. Trotter spent his life pursuing the cause of civil rights and equality. Until his death in 1934, Trotter fought for the equal treatment of African American soldiers, presented demands for civil rights in France after World War I, and fought for federal anti-lynching legislation. Like Wilson in trying to get the U.S. to join the League of Nations, Trotter ultimately died disappointed, his cause unfulfilled. But Trotter's victory was merely deferred. To this day, we continue to work towards the same ideals that he espoused, and generation after generation, his legacy continues to drive us. Just last month, President Biden signed the Emmett Till law, making lynching a federal crime. Last year, the Wilson Center established the William Monroe Trotter Leadership Award to symbolically reject Wilson's legacy of racism and segregation. This award recognizes those who have brought diversity to our foreign policy community and helped to extend American foreign policy and national security leadership. This award is meant to remind us that true visionary leadership, like that of William Monroe Trotter, doesn't always result in change right away. It may take years or even lifetimes, but change comes eventually due to the hard work of people like William Monroe Trotter and the ideals he espoused, like his personal motto, "For every right, with all thy might." I would like to thank the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice, especially Professor Cornell Brooks, for the leadership and partnership in these issues. Their work continues to espouse the ideals, energy, and commitment that Trotter's legacy demands. It is an honor to work with you, and thank you so much for including me in this historic event.